Hey folks, with the launch of Dragonflight Season 4, you'll be able to return to all 3 raids from this expansion and tackle scaled up versions of the bosses. Mechanically, they'll function the same as they did when each raid was current content, but their damage and health values are increased to provide a greater challenge. If you're familiar with the faded raids that we got in Shadowlands, I am happy to inform you that this time around there will be no additional affixes within each raid. These raids will be empowered on a set rotation, with Vault being active for weeks 1 and 4, Avarice being up for weeks 2 and 5, and Emirdrassil being buffed on weeks 3 and 6. From week 7 onwards until the launch of the next expansion, all 3 raids will be empowered at once. In this video, I'll teach you how to handle every single boss from all 3 Dragonflight raids on normal and heroic difficulty. I'll start by discussing Vault of the Incarnates, which will be the active raid during the 1st and 4th week of Season 4. After clearing the initial trash, you'll be able to face Eranog, the first encounter of the raid. Eranog's fight takes place in a gigantic circular room, and your tank should drag the boss towards the wall at the start of the encounter. Throughout Phase 1, you'll want to rotate clockwise around the room in order to avoid the lava puddles spawned by Eranog's first ability, Flame Rift. This ability is a debuff that he'll apply to multiple random DPS or healers. When the debuff expires, the affected player will explode and inflict damage to anyone standing within 4 yards. Additionally, this explosion causes a pool of lava to drop on the floor, which starts out small but will expand slightly over time. In order to conserve space, you should try to have everyone with the debuff stand fairly close together to make their puddles overlap, but not so close that you hit other people with your circle. You should also make sure that you move counterclockwise when dropping your puddles so that you don't block off your group when they try to move the boss. Once these puddles appear, they'll spawn a Flamescale Terrasec ad which fixates upon a random player and chases them down. This ad deals moderate auto-attack damage if it gets into melee range of its target, but these mobs can be fully CC'd, so your raid should stun and kill all of the Terrasecs as quickly as possible. Eranog's tank swap mechanic is called Burning Wound, and it's simply a stacking debuff that gets applied whenever he lands an auto-attack. While there isn't a specific stack amount that you're forced to swap at, I personally found that swapping at 5 to 7 stacks felt pretty safe. As players drop off their flame rifts and rotate around the room, Eranog will periodically cast 3 additional abilities. Molten Cleave is a large chronal AoE that will target a random player. When you hear Eranog yell, "Burn to cinders!" keep an eye out for the big orange cone and walk out of it before you get hit. Eranog's next ability is Molten Spikes, and this is unique to the heroic difficulty version of the encounter. Eranog will periodically cause these spikes to burst through the ground, dealing heavy damage to anyone that gets hit. Eranog's final Phase 1 ability is Incinerating Roar, which is an unavoidable hit to the entire raid that leaves behind a stacking dot. Additionally, whenever this roar goes off, it causes any active molten spikes to explode into a line of swirly AoE circles that deal moderate bonus damage to anyone hit. Once 3 sets of Flame Rifts have gone out, Eranog will run to the center of the room and transition into Phase 2. After a few seconds, Eranog will summon a ring of fire elementals around the sides of the room, and they'll begin to slowly move towards the boss. Each of these elementals is connected by a chain, and touching this chain causes you to die immediately. In order to survive this mechanic, your raid will need to kill one of the fire elementals in order to punch a hole through the chain, allowing you to walk through unscathed. There's no advantage to killing multiple fire elementals, so once you escape the ring, you should just wait around for Eranog to return to Phase 1. It's worth noting that while Eranog is attackable during this phase, you need to be extremely careful about doing this, especially if you're a melee DPS. This is because the fire elementals will explode in a fairly wide radius once they reach the boss, and this explosion deals lethal damage to anyone hit. If you're planning to sneak in a bit of extra damage during this phase, just make sure that you run away before the fire elementals make it to the center of the room. From here, Eranog will switch back into Phase 1, and the fight will repeat this 2-phase cycle until you kill him or he kills you. Once Eranog has been defeated, 2 different wings will open up, allowing you to fight either Terros or the Primal Council. For the purposes of this guide, we'll be discussing Terros next. The room in which you fight Terros is shaped like a donut, and the boss will remain stationary in the central pit for the entirety of the encounter. The general cadence of the fight is as follows. Terros will summon 2 sets of rock pillars which the tank needs to break, and the rest of the raid will have to deal with various other mechanics such as dodging swirlies or soaking circles. Once Terros reaches full energy, he'll cover 1/4 of the room in an earthquake that deals heavy ticking damage to anyone standing inside of it. At this point, the phase will repeat 3 more times until all 4 quarters of the room are covered in unavoidable earthquakes. If Terros is not dead by then, he'll enrage and quickly wipe the raid. Now that you understand the general progression of the fight, we can take a look at some individual mechanics that Terros will cast. Rock Blast is an ability which targets a random player with a gigantic soak circle. Your entire raid needs to stand inside of this circle in order to split the incoming damage. After Rock Blast is soaked, it'll leave behind a large AoE patch which explodes after a few seconds, so anyone soaking this mechanic needs to run away immediately. Additionally, while Rock Blast is being cast, random DPS and healer players will receive a debuff called Awakened Earth. As soon as the soak circle explodes, a rock pillar will shoot up from the ground beneath each of these debuffed players. This eruption will deal damage to the affected player, and it also hits anyone standing within 2 yards. These rock pillars will then pulse unavoidable damage onto the raid every 2 seconds, and this puts heavy strain on your healers. Obviously, you'll want to get rid of these rock pillars as quickly as possible, and you're going to accomplish this by using Terros' next mechanic, Concussive Slam. This is a large heavy-hitting rectangular AoE aimed at the current tank, and it causes anyone hit to take 40% increased damage for 45 seconds. This serves as the taunt swap mechanic for the fight, and your tank should taunt when it reaches 2 stacks. The slam will also destroy any rock pillars in its path, causing them to explode for raid-wide damage and applying a stacking 12-second dot to all players. I generally recommend that you break no more than 4 pillars at one time, as otherwise your healers will struggle to keep up with the dot. This mechanic will likely be the cause of most of your wipes, so it's important that everyone in your raid is aware of how to handle it. When the Awakened Earth debuffs go out, the affected players should quickly divide themselves into 2 separate groups on opposite sides of the soak circle. Once the explosion goes off, the pillars will emerge in neatly packed together clusters. This will make it extremely easy for the tanks to clear the pillars without accidentally breaking too many at once. The final mechanic that Terros will cast is Shattering Impact. This is simply a large AoE circle targeted at a random location in melee range, and everyone should move away from it to avoid being hit. Once the large AoE goes off, multiple smaller swirly AoE circles will appear throughout the room, and players will have to dodge these as well. On Heroic, these swirlies will also leave behind a permanent patch in the ground which deals moderate ticking damage to anyone standing inside. As previously mentioned, Terros will cast Resonating Annihilation whenever he reaches maximum energy, causing him to effectively destroy 1/4 of the room. This ability will also cause any remaining rock pillars to explode, and it spawns a few additional swirly AoE circles throughout the room. Your raid should decide beforehand whether to move clockwise or counterclockwise, and then everyone should run in that direction when Terros begins casting his big slam. At this point, Terros will repeat his original phase 3 more times, and with every new phase, the boss will cause 1 additional rock pillar to be created with every set. The rest of the fight is effectively just a damage race to defeat Terros before he destroys the entire room or overwhelms your healers. After killing Terros, your raid will unlock access to Sennarth, which is the next boss in this wing. However, many groups will opt to double back and face the Primal Council first, as it's a significantly easier fight. During this encounter, you're tasked with defeating 4 different bosses, and each one has access to 3 unique abilities. At a glance, this may seem overwhelming, so I want to start by breaking down all of the abilities of the fight into 3 simple categories. First, there are the generic spells. For Dathea and Kadros, these are Lightning Bolt and Frostspike, respectively. Both abilities are your run-of-the-mill damage-dealing spells which players can interrupt. Throughout the fight, your raid should try to interrupt as many of these casts as possible in order to help out the healers, but otherwise they're not very important. Dathea will also cast a second spell called Chain Lightning, but it's not interruptible and it isn't dangerous enough to be worth playing around. Just treat the Chain Lightning as unavoidable raid damage. Embar, Firepath, and Opalfang will cast tank busters called Slashing Blaze and Crush, respectively. At the start of the fight, one tank should pick up Opalfang, and the other should grab Embar. Since both of these tank busters leave behind a nasty debuff, you should taunt swap after these 2 abilities are cast. It's worth noting that Embar's Slashing Blaze is an AoE cone, meaning it needs to be faced away from the raid, while Opalfang's Crush will always hit only the tank and nobody else. While there's a bit more strategy involved in how you should tank this fight, I'll be discussing that more towards the end of the video when I cover the overall strategy and boss positioning. For now, I want to move on to the second type of mechanics you'll see in the fight, that being the on-death abilities. Although these are technically 4 different spells, each boss will cast a near-identical Convocation ability after they die. In practice, this is just the soft enrage of the fight, as Blizzard wants to ensure that you kill all bosses at roughly the same time instead of burning them down one by one. If you're doing the fight properly and cleaving the bosses down evenly, you probably won't even realize that these abilities exist. Now, we can finally look at the last category of abilities in this fight, which are the core mechanics that your raid will need to deal with. These abilities are Primal Blizzard from Kadros, Conductive Mark from Dathea, Earthen Pillar from Opalfang, and Meteor Axes from Embar. You might notice that a lot of these abilities interact with each other, so let's break them down one by one, starting with Kadros' Primal Blizzard. This mechanic is the most straightforward, as it's a raid-wide AoE that applies a stacking debuff to all players. If this debuff reaches 10 stacks, the affected players become encased in a block of ice that needs to be broken by the rest of the raid. In order to clear your debuff, you'll need to step into a large patch of fire, which is created by Embar's ability, Meteor Axes. Ideally, you'll want to clear your debuff as late as possible, as that means you'll be taking less damage over time. That being said, you will only need to step into the fire patch once during the entire Primal Blizzard cast in order to ensure that you don't get turned into a block of ice. Since I just mentioned it, I'll discuss Embar's Meteor Axe ability next. When cast, Embar targets multiple random DPS or healers with a large fiery soak circle. Everyone in your raid needs to stand inside of this circle in order to split the incoming damage. As previously mentioned, the Meteor Axes leave behind a large pool of fire at the location they land, and you'll then need to use it to counteract Primal Blizzard. Finally, the players targeted by Meteor Axes should try to move on top of nearby earthen pillars, as the explosion will destroy any pillars that get hit. These earth pillars are Opalfang's core mechanic, and she'll periodically summon them throughout the fight. On normal difficulty, these pillars don't actually do anything. They're just a minor inconvenience as they take up physical space within the room. However, on heroic difficulty, these pillars will deal constant pulsing damage to your raid, which can quickly overwhelm your healers if there's too many active at the same time. This is why it's extremely important for the players targeted by Meteor Axe to destroy as many earthen pillars as possible. That being said, you'll still want to leave at least one or two of the pillars alive in order to deal with Dathea's special ability, Conductive Mark. When cast, this applies a 20-second dot to multiple players, and if anyone in your raid gets too close to one of the circles surrounding these affected players, Conductive Mark will be duplicated onto them. If your group isn't careful, these marks can quickly bounce onto everyone in your raid, which puts a ton of strain on your healers. In order to clear this debuff, affected players will need to run over to an earthen pillar, as coming into contact with one will completely remove Conductive Mark. For this reason, your raid group should try to avoid standing near any of the pillars, as you don't want to block them off from anyone trying to get rid of their debuffs. Also, while the Conductive Mark will technically expire after 20 seconds, I would highly recommend clearing it off instantly, instead of waiting out the timer. All it takes is for one person to make a silly mistake at the last second, and then suddenly Conductive Mark will refresh its duration and cascade across the raid group. This single mechanic is the hardest part of Primal Council, so if your raid group learns how to handle it properly, the bosses should die fairly easily. While that covers all of the actual mechanics of the fight, I want to finish the guide by discussing some general strategy tips which are also quite important. When it comes to boss positioning, there are two equally popular strategies that you can choose from. Some groups will opt to keep all of the bosses stationary in the center of the room. The tanks will then aim Embar's Blazing Slash at the back wall, the ranged will bait mechanics towards the entrance of the room, and the melee will sit behind the bosses and maintain full uptime. The pros of this strategy are that it makes things extremely simple for your tanks and melee DPS. Now, boss movement means that tanks don't need to worry about positioning, and melee can just sit still and focus on their damage. The downside of this strategy is that it makes life a living hell for your healers and ranged DPS. In order to make sure that your raid has enough space, ranged and healers will need to be really smart about where they bait earthen pillars and where they drop Meteor Axes. This also means that the strat is extremely punishing, as having a fire puddle dropped right in the middle of the room can cause the entire strategy to fall apart. This is the type of strat that sounds really simple in theory, but ultimately devolves into pure chaos in 90% of realistic scenarios. The second strategy, which is my personal preference and the one used by my guild, is the rotation strat. This involves kiting all four bosses around the edges of the room in a clockwise direction. Instead of stacking in the middle, one tank will face their boss clockwise, and the other will face the boss against the wall. The rest of the raid will then group up behind the bosses and trail the tanks as they slowly kite around the room. The only downside to this strategy is that it makes the fight much harder for melee DPS, as they'll usually need to move off the boss in order to clear their debuffs for Conductive Mark or Primal Blizzard. However, this strategy will make things infinitely easier for ranged and healers, as they don't have to spend as much time baiting mechanics, allowing them to spend more time planting in one spot to do damage or healing. Lastly, the strategy is incredibly flexible and allows you to easily recover from mistakes. If you drop fire puddles or earth pillars in the wrong spot, no problem, your tanks can simply drag the bosses a bit further around the room in order to give your raid the space they need to handle the mechanics properly. As long as you keep the boss room clean of mechanics and don't mess up Conductive Mark, Primal Council should fall over in no time. Defeating the Council will unlock the ability to face Dathea Ascended, though once again, I'd recommend tackling this boss later on as it's a major step up in difficulty. Most guilds will opt to fight Sennarth as their 4th encounter, so I'll be discussing that boss next. The cadence of Sennarth's fight is fairly interesting. At the start of the encounter, Sennarth can be found dangling in the air off to the side of the platform, and she's accompanied by a few different spider ads. On pull, one of the tanks will need to get aggro on Sennarth, and the other should grab the big spider ad, Frostbreath Arachnid. Sennarth will cast the primary taunt swap mechanic of the fight, which is called Web Blast. Generally speaking, your tank should taunt swap after this debuff reaches 4 to 5 stacks, as the damage gets fairly close to being lethal if you let it stack any higher. Your DPS should focus on killing the Frostbreath Arachnid as quickly as possible, since it deals constant pulsing damage to your group. This Arachnid will also cast Freezing Breath at its current tank, which deals heavy damage to anyone hit and creates ice patches on the ground. Throughout Phase 1, Sennarth will periodically spray additional ice patches across the room. While the ice will deal damage like a traditional AoE patch, the most dangerous part about it is the fact that it's slippery. If you try to walk across the ice, your character will begin to slide around, and if you're not careful, this can send you flying straight off the platform. Your sliding isn't random though. The game will simply carry your momentum forward in whatever direction you're trying to move, just like the ice physics in almost every other game. While this ice may sound fairly annoying, it's counteracted by Sennarth's next mechanic, Enveloping Webs. This is a debuff applied to multiple players, and in addition to dealing light damage, it causes them to drop patches of webs beneath their feet. When you stand inside one of these webs, you'll gain stacks of a debuff called Sticky Webbing, which reduces your movement speed. On Heroic, if this debuff hits 10 stacks, it'll cause the player to be trapped inside of an unattackable web prison. Should someone in your raid become stuck, you'll need to drag one of the tiny spiders on top of them and kill it, as their on-death explosion will destroy any nearby webs. This isn't always a good thing though, as you will need to use these webs to counteract Sennarth's next ability, Gossamer Burst. This ability will attach a little string to every single player, and the boss will attempt to use this string to drag you off the platform. The pull effect is extremely powerful, so while you can outrun it using an ability such as Heroic Leap or Chi Torpedo, that should generally only be used as a last resort. The intended way to handle this mechanic is to stand inside of one of the web patches, as they completely negate the pull from Gossamer Burst. Just be sure to move out the moment the pull effect ends, as you don't want to gain too many stacks of the web debuff. Sennarth's final Phase 1 ability is Chilling Blast, which just applies an AoE circle to every player in the raid. As long as you maintain a loose spread and don't overlap any of your circles, this should be pretty easy to deal with. Following her first cast of Gossamer Burst, Sennarth will begin to ascend the nearby spiral staircase. This is technically still part of Phase 1, as none of the mechanics actually change. However, it can be a little bit tricky to handle Sennarth's next Gossamer Burst, as it will be cast while she's in the middle of moving up the staircase. If your class is high mobility, you can just run against the pole like I'm doing in this footage. However, if you don't have any way to resist it, you'll just be forced to wait around inside of a web patch and catch up to your group after the fact. Sennarth will reach a new platform after about a minute and a half, at which point she'll stop moving and spawn a new Frostbreath Arachnid. Like before, all of your DPS should swap to the spider and kill it off as quickly as possible. After 30 seconds, Sennarth will cast another Gossamer Burst and begin her ascent to the third platform. This entire process will repeat until Sennarth reaches her 4th and final platform, at which point she'll land on the ground and begin Phase 2. Right off the bat, Sennarth will begin casting Apex of Ice, reducing her damage taken by 99% and dealing pulsing damage to the group. As long as someone in your raid is close enough to immediately interrupt this cast, it shouldn't be an issue. Sennarth's second phase is effectively just a damage race to kill the boss before you get overwhelmed. As the fight goes on, your raid will begin to take ramping frost damage, and this serves as the soft enrage of the fight. That being said, there are still a few significant mechanical changes that you need to be aware of. For starters, Sennarth's Chilling Blast now leaves behind a bomb called a Glacial Plume. Coming into contact with this bomb will cause players to take heavy damage and be knocked back, potentially leading to a chain reaction where you get bounced into multiple glacial plumes. You might think that this will be easy to avoid, but the entirety of the final platform is an ice patch, which means you'll always be sliding around. It's crucial that everyone drops their Chilling Blasts on the edges of the room, as the center area needs to be clear of glacial plumes. If your group finds it necessary, you can also use certain immunities to clear out the glacial plumes in a section of the room. As if the first mechanic wasn't tricky enough, Enveloping Webs now gets upgraded into Suffocating Webs, and a tank will be targeted every single time. This debuff now only drops a single web patch, and it also instantly web wraps the affected player and knocks them back. If your back is facing towards a ledge, this mechanic will almost always get you killed, as the force of the knock will cause you to slide on the ice and fly off the edge of the platform. The only way to survive this mechanic is to stand with your back towards a long stretch of ice, as you can't risk being shot off the edge or hitting a glacial plume. If you manage to do that, your group will still need to kill a caustic spiderling on top of your web wrap in order to free you. Finally, Sennarth's Gossamer Burst is replaced by Repelling Burst in Phase 2. The key difference here is that Sennarth will now knock players away from her instead of pulling them in. The same rules apply though, so if you stand inside of a web patch, you should be fine. If Sennarth's Phase 2 mechanics sound complicated and chaotic, that's because they honestly are. If you spend too long in this part of the fight, people in your raid will start to die. As mentioned before, the entirety of Phase 2 is effectively a race against time to defeat Sennarth before your raid is overwhelmed by these mechanics. Upon defeating Sennarth, you can access the final boss within this wing, Kurog Grimtotem. Both he and Dathea are comparable in difficulty, so I'll just discuss Kurog first and get around to Dathea second. The first and most important thing to understand about this boss is how the layout of the room will affect his mechanics. If you look at the ground, you'll notice that it's broken up into 5 distinct areas. 4 of these sections are affected by the nearby elemental altars, and if you drag Kurog into them, he'll gain a new set of abilities. The circular area in the center effectively serves as a no man's land, and if you tank Kurog here, he'll instantly wipe your raid. Your initial thought might be, awesome, so I'll just figure out which quarter of the room has the easiest mechanics, and we can do the entirety of the fight in that section. Unfortunately, Blizzard predicted that, so you'll begin to take increasing raid-wide damage the longer you stay inside of a single quadrant. The end result is that your raid will be forced to move Kurog through all 4 of the different elemental quadrants, as allowing the debuff to reach high stacks will eventually overwhelm your healers. In addition to all of this, Kurog will periodically become immune and start an intermission phase where your raid will be forced to fight a variety of large elemental adds, each with their own set of additional mechanics. I know all of this may sound a bit overwhelming, so I'm going to start breaking down all of the individual mechanics before I review the big picture strategy. To kick things off, I'll quickly review Kurog's 2 basic abilities that aren't tied to any particular phase. The first is Sundering Strike, which is the primary tank buster for the entire fight. This ability will deal heavy damage in a cone aimed at the current tank, and upon being hit, they'll be sent flying backwards. Tanks should taunt Kurog after each cast of Sundering Strike, and you should ideally use your taunt while the ability is being cast. Once Kurog has targeted a specific tank, his Sundering Strike will lock onto them, so you don't need to worry about accidentally spinning him around and hitting the raid with the tank buster. The main advantage to taunting him early is that it causes Kurog to stand still the moment he finishes his cast. Otherwise, he may chase after the tank that's been knocked back, and this can cause the melee DPS to lose a bit of uptime. The only other basic ability is Primal Shift, which is just a light burst of damage that hits the raid after Kurog enters a new elemental area. This mechanic only really exists to prevent your raid from quickly bouncing around between the different elemental phases. If you try to do this, Primal Shift will quickly kill you, but otherwise it's not a mechanic that you need to be concerned about. With those 2 abilities out of the way, we can take a look at the different mechanics tied to each elemental altar. The first elemental phase we'll discuss is Frost, which is generally considered to be the easiest one. Each elemental phase has 3 special mechanics, but for Frost, the first one is simply an additional damage over time effect that gets applied to the entire raid. The second ability is a bullet hell mechanic called Frigid Torrent. When cast, Kurog will shoot out waves of frost orbs that deal heavy damage to anyone hit, in addition to applying a 6-second stun. Obviously, getting hit by one of these orbs is really bad, so you should make avoiding them your top priority. If this means that you need to run out of melee range just to ensure that you don't die, that's totally fine. As always, you'll do more damage alive than you will if you're dead. Absolute Zero is the final Frost phase mechanic, and this ability will debuff 2 players in your raid with a large soak circle. If you try to soak both circles at the same time, you'll be stunned for 10 seconds and take a hefty chunk of damage. Generally speaking, I'd recommend having the melee and tank soak one circle, while the ranged DPS and healers soak another. If you have an unbalanced raid comp though, you may need to manually create 2 groups to split the damage on the soaks. When your raid enters the fire phase, you should all stay stacked up in order to handle the first mechanic, Magma Burst. This deals moderate damage to random players in your raid and causes a fire puddle to drop beneath their feet. If your raid is spread out all over the room, these fire puddles will make it really hard to move around. However, if you're stacked up nice and tidy, the puddles will drop on top of each other, allowing you to easily conserve space. The second mechanic is Molten Rupture, which is just a series of little fire lines that Kurog shoots out from his location. Your raid should move to a safe spot to avoid the damage, and then everyone should stack back up to deal with Magma Burst. The final fire mechanic is Searing Carnage, and if you happen to raid in Castle Nathria, this is functionally identical to Dark Recital from Council of Blood. A handful of players in your raid will receive this debuff, and it causes them to drop AoE circles at their location for 5 seconds. After 2 seconds, these AoE swirlies will explode, so the affected players will need to run away to make sure they don't blow themselves up. Provided your raid is actually stacking up properly, handling this ability should be really easy. When it gets cast, all debuffed players will run towards the right, and all unaffected players will run to the left. Once all circles have exploded, your raid should stack back up and prepare for the next mechanic. Next up is the Earth phase, and the first ability Kurog casts here is Enveloping Earth. This ability will just hit a few random players with a massive healing absorb, and your healers will need to focus these players down in order to remove the absorb before they take too much damage. The primary mechanic in this phase is Erupting Bedrock, which causes Kurog to send out an expanding circular ring that deals massive damage to anyone hit. I've seen many people overcomplicate this mechanic, but it's honestly really simple. When the ring is about to explode, run all the way up to its edge and stop. The moment it goes off and expands once again, you can take a few steps forward and you'll end up in the safe zone. The final mechanic in this phase is Seismic Rupture, which causes multiple large AoE swirlies to appear throughout the room. These swirlies deal massive damage to anyone hit, and they'll also summon an Earthbreaker ad after they explode. Your tank should try to round these ads up under the boss as quickly as possible, but one tank shouldn't be holding all of the elementals at once. This is because the elementals have a passive effect which causes them to deal ramping damage the longer they attack a specific target. If one tank is holding all of the elementals for too long, they might get outright one-shot by the auto attacks. Because of this, your DPS should swap to the elementals and nuke them down as quickly as possible. Additionally, you should use any available AoE stuns on these ads, as it'll give the tanks a bit more breathing room. The final elemental phase is Storm, and while this is considered to be the hardest one, the mechanics are all thankfully very straightforward. Shocking Burst is a debuff applied to multiple random players, and it deals AoE damage to anyone within 12 yards after 5 seconds. If you get affected by this debuff, run out of the raid so you don't blow everyone up. Conversely, Lightning Crash is a debuff applied to random players, which you should bring into the raid, as it deals light ticking damage that needs to be split with another player. The final mechanic, Thunderstrike, causes multiple AoE circles to appear throughout the room. If these circles aren't soaked by any players, they'll explode and wipe the raid. This is a fairly standard soak circle mechanic, and only one person needs to stand inside of each circle. That covers all of the mechanics for each individual phase, but we still need to talk about the intermission. After Kurog reaches 100 energy, he'll leap into the center of the room and become immune to damage. At this point, he'll also summon 2 elemental ads, and these will be based on which quarters of the room your raid spent the most time in. For instance, if you started off in the Storm section and then moved into Earth after 1 minute, you'll have to fight a Storm and an Earth elemental during the intermission. If the fight lasts long enough for you to get a second intermission, Kurog will always summon the 2 elemental ads that you didn't fight during the first intermission. So, once again, if you fought Storm and Earth during the first set, you'll always fight Fire and Ice during the second set. As for the actual mechanics, each elemental has a passive presence ability, which deals ramping ticking damage to the entire raid. The Storm elemental has one other special mechanic called Stormbreak. When cast, the elemental will teleport behind a random player and channel lethal current into them after a few seconds. This spell will cause the targeted player to pulse damage onto anyone standing within 8 yards, so if you get targeted, you should quickly run away from the rest of your raid. The Earth Elemental has 3 special mechanics, the first of which is Ground Shatter. This targets multiple players with a debuff that explodes after 5 seconds. When it goes off, anyone within 10 yards will take heavy damage, and it leaves behind a large patch on the ground. As the fight goes on, I'd recommend dropping your debuffs onto existing patches, as this will help your raid conserve space within the room. The Earth Ellie's second ability is Violent Upheaval, which just causes all of the existing Earth patches to explode for additional damage. You should never really be standing inside of an Earth patch regardless, so this mechanic is effectively non-existent. Finally, as the Earth Ellie continues to hit the same target, it gains stacks of Breaking Gravel, which increases the damage of its auto attacks. Tanks should try to taunt swap on this elemental every so often, as this prevents the stacks from getting too high. The Fire Elemental only has one ability, that being Magma Flow. This causes pools of lava to spawn underneath random players, and little ads called Smoldering Hellions will periodically appear from these lava pools. These ads should be rounded up underneath the big elemental, and DPS should cleave them down over time. They'll periodically cast an interruptible spell called Flame Bolt, which simply deals a moderate amount of damage to a random player. Ideally, you should kick every Flame Bolt cast in order to help out the healers, but if one of them slips through, it's not the end of the world. Finally, the Frost Elemental has two special mechanics. Frostbinds is an interruptible spell that deals raid-wide damage and applies a slow if it's allowed to go off. It's crucial that every single cast of Frostbinds gets interrupted. The Elemental's second ability is Freezing Tempest. This causes a large translucent bubble to appear around the Frost Ellie, and after a few seconds, it'll deal massive pulsing damage to the entire raid. If you're standing inside of the bubble, the damage is easy to survive, but if you're standing far away, you'll die very quickly. In case it isn't obvious, the moment you see Freezing Tempest being cast, your entire raid needs to stack up underneath the Frost Elemental. Well, that finally covers all of the mechanics for Kurog Grimtotem. I want to end the guide by taking a step back and discussing how all of this will play out in an actual fight. The main question that I'm sure many of you have is what order you should do the different elemental phases in. While there are obviously many possible combinations, I'd recommend starting off in the Earth phase and then moving into Storm after the Earth debuff reaches roughly 20 stacks. You'll then keep Kurog here until the first intermission, which will task you with fighting the Earth and Storm adds at the same time. During the intermission, you should slowly shift towards the Ice section of the room, as this is where you'll want to bring Kurog once both elementals are dead. Just like before, you'll keep Kurog here until the Ice debuff reaches 20 stacks, at which point you should move him into the Fire section and keep Kurog there until the second intermission. By process of elimination, you'll be fighting the Frost and Fire elementals during this second intermission. Finally, once you've gotten through the second intermission, you should drag Kurog into the Storm phase and keep him there until you kill him or he kills you. Once you've killed off Kurog, you can run over to the opposite side of the raid in order to fight Dathea Ascended. Killing both her and Kurog is required in order to access the final two bosses within Vault of the Incarnates. The most important thing to establish about Dathea is that she's a stationary boss just like Terros, even if she may not seem like one based on her model. At the start of the fight, tanks will need to get into melee range as quickly as possible, since she'll spamcast Aerial Buffet if nobody is within range of her. Her primary tank buster throughout the fight is Zephyr Slam. This ability deals heavy damage to the current tank and sends them flying backwards. Each time you get hit by Zephyr Slam, it leaves behind a debuff which increases the damage and knockback from subsequent hits. In most cases, the actual damage you'll take from this ability isn't a huge concern, but at high stacks, the increased knockback has a chance to send you flying off of a cliff, which kills you instantly. I'll touch back on this ability at the end of the guide when discussing the overall strategy, as that'll have a large influence on how you handle Zephyr Slam and how many stacks you swap at. Dathea herself has 5 additional mechanics that she'll cast throughout the fight. Raging Burst will cause AoE swirlies to appear throughout the room, and they'll summon a tornado wherever they land. These tornadoes will do light pulsing damage to the entire raid, and anyone who comes into contact with one will take moderate damage and get knocked into the air. Dathea will also sometimes cast an ability called Crosswinds, which causes the tornadoes to change positions. When this is being cast, keep an eye out for the arrows in the ground near the tornadoes, as they indicate where each tornado will be moving. This certainly isn't the easiest mechanic to avoid, and it's not the end of the world if you get hit, but you should still make a concerted effort to move into a safe area. Dathea's next mechanic is Conductive Mark, which functions exactly like her ability of the same name on Primal Council. The key difference here is that you don't have any earthen pillars around to remove your debuff, so your raid is forced to maintain a loose spread and let the debuffs time out. Whenever you see Dathea casting Cyclone, everyone in your raid, including the tanks, needs to run out of melee range. Once she begins channeling this ability, your entire raid will take light ticking damage and be dragged towards Dathea. If you get pulled into the center of Dathea's Cyclone, she'll send you flying really far up into the air. Although the damage from this fall won't kill you, you should still do your best to run against the Cyclone and avoid being pulled into the center. Your raid should make use of abilities such as Stampeding Roar or Windrush Totem to help out classes that aren't able to run against the pull on their own. Dathea's final ability is Coalescing Storm. This spell will summon a Volatile Infuser ad near Dathea, and it also summons a large group of ads on a randomly selected platform around the boss arena. On this platform, you'll find 1 additional Volatile Infuser, as well as 6 Thundercallers. The moment these ads spawn, one of the tanks needs to pick up the nearby Volatile Infuser and drag it to the ledge closest to the other ads. When the Volatile Infuser dies, it'll cast an ability called Blowback, which knocks everyone in the raid away from its location. Before the fight begins, you should divide your raid into 2 evenly sized groups, and these groups will take turns using the Blowback ability to launch themselves onto the ad platforms. If you're not currently assigned to go up and fight the ads, you still need to move towards the Infuser just to make sure that Blowback doesn't send you flying off the opposite end of Dathea's platform. At this point, anyone still on the main platform will continue fighting Dathea and dealing with her normal mechanics, but the group on the ad platform needs to kill all of the elementals as quickly as possible. The moment you land, the tank will need to interrupt the Volatile Infuser's diverted essence channel, as this increases Dathea's damage for 10% while it remains active. All of the Thunder Callers should then be rounded up underneath the Infuser, and your raid should try to coordinate a chain of AoE stuns to prevent them from casting. The only ability cast by the Thunder Callers is Stormbolt, an interruptible hit on a random player. While this may not seem too scary, the damage can potentially overwhelm your healers if too many casts are allowed to go off. Once all of the Thunder Callers are dead, you'll need to finish off the Volatile Infuser and use its on-death knockback to return to Dathea's platform. Just be careful where you stand while waiting for the blowback, as the Volatile Infuser ad will also periodically cast Unstable Gusts, which causes nasty AoE swirlies to appear beneath everyone's feet. Finally, while you remain on the ad platform, you'll gain a stacking damage over time effect called Thunderbolts. This is the primary reason why you'll want to divide your raid into 2 separate groups, which each take turns clearing out the ad platforms. If the same group of people handled every single set of ads, their Thunderbolt stacks would get insanely high, and they would eventually become unhealable. With that, we've covered everything you need to know in order to defeat Dathea if you're a DPS or healer. When your group is assigned to fight the ads, you'll get knocked up to the platform and clear them out. Otherwise, just tunnel into Dathea and avoid dying to Tornadoes, Conductive Mark, and Cyclone. However, for tanks, we still need to return to Zephyr Slam and discuss it in a bit more detail. Since one of the tanks will need to handle every single ad platform, this is effectively what will dictate your taunt swaps, rather than a specific number of stacks. However, the time in which it takes your raid to kill the ads isn't fixed, which means the amount of stacks you'll end up swapping at can vary wildly depending on your raid's damage output. On my guild's first kill of Heroic Dathea, I was forced to survive up to 5 stacks of Zephyr Slam before my co-tank was able to taunt the boss. Because of this, my general recommendation is that you should always expect to take 5 hits of Zephyr Slam, and you should plan your cooldown usage accordingly. If your co-tank makes it back to the platform a bit earlier, then awesome, he can taunt the boss and you'll have a much easier time. While this sounds great in theory, the reality is that not all tanks are created equal. If you're a Prot Warrior, Blood DK, Guardian Druid, or Vengeance DH, you can completely negate the knockback on Zephyr Slam by using Charge, Death's Advance, Wild Charge, and Glide, respectively. This makes the entire mechanic fairly trivial, as you're never at risk of being knocked off the platform, and you can focus entirely on surviving the raw damage from Zephyr Slam. Unfortunately, Brewmaster Monks and Prot Pallies are shit out of luck. Monks technically have one use of Transcendence which they can cast to negate the knock from Zephyr Slam, but you'll generally want to save this to cancel the knockback from the Volatile Infuser's death. Paladins, meanwhile, have absolutely nothing in their kit to deal with the knockbacks. If you're tanking this as one of these 2 classes, the only reliable way to survive high stacks of Zephyr Slam is by placing your back to a tornado. If you get knocked back into one of these, it'll cancel your momentum and launch you into the air, which prevents you from being sent flying off the platform. That said, while this is your only available option, it's still not great, as the tornado will deal additional damage to you, and you'll be slammed with multiple aerial buffets as you attempt to get back into melee range. Speaking as someone who progged this fight as a Brewmaster Monk, it is possible, but you're going to have a bad time. Upon killing both Dathea and Kurog, the path towards the penultimate boss, Broodkeeper Diurna, will open. Before the fight begins, you'll need to divide your raid into 2 equally sized groups. One of these groups should prioritize single target boss damage, while the other group will focus on AoE damage and crowd control. At the very beginning of the fight, everyone in your raid should be hitting the boss, as it will take 30 seconds for the first wave of ads to spawn. During this phase, Broodkeeper Diurna will cast 4 different abilities, the first of which is Mortal Stoneclaws. This is Diurna's primary tank buster, and in addition to dealing a large amount of physical and nature damage, it'll apply 2 debuffs. Mortal Wounds will reduce your healing received by 65% for 8 seconds, and Crushing Stoneclaws will deal moderate damage over 4 seconds. You might be thinking, wow, that tank buster sounds really nasty. When should tanks be taunt swapping? But that's the neat part, you don't. If you're the tank assigned to Broodkeeper Diurna, you'll be the sole person holding the boss for the entire fight. While Mortal Stoneclaws is a really nasty tank hit, it doesn't actually cause you to take increased damage from subsequent hits, so it's actually not too difficult for a single tank to deal with every single cast. I've seen some guilds run 3 tanks and have 2 of them taunt swap off Diurna to make the fight a bit easier, but I consider this strat to be a crutch, so I won't be covering it. If you're not the tank assigned to hold Broodkeeper Diurna, don't worry, because I'll be discussing your job later in the video. Diurna has 2 more filler spells that she'll cast during Phase 1. Wildfire will deal damage to all nearby players, and you'll need to spread out in order to avoid splashing damage onto another member of your raid. On Heroic, these circles will also leave behind an AoE swirly after they explode. Diurna will also periodically cast Icy Shroud, which is a spell that hits all nearby players for moderate damage and applies a slow and healing absorb to them. Healers should be prepared to remove this healing absorb as quickly as possible, as it means the raid won't be affected by the slow for any significant amount of time. Now that we've discussed these minor abilities, we can talk about Rapid Incubation, which is the primary mechanic of the fight. Throughout the room, you'll notice a ton of little dragon eggs sitting on the floor. In order to progress through the fight, every single dragon egg will need to be destroyed, as otherwise Diurna will simply prevent herself from taking damage. The exact details of this buff are pretty complicated, but I have it shown on screen now if you want to read through it fully. For the purposes of the fight, all you really need to understand is that breaking all of the eggs is required for the boss to die. The only way to actually do this is by using Diurna's staff, which she'll plant in the ground immediately after casting Rapid Incubation. This causes 2 eggs to begin hatching, and if they aren't destroyed in time, a dragon will pop out of the egg and begin attacking your raid. You'll need to use the extra action button granted by Diurna's staff in order to kite a lightning beam over one of the nearby eggs to destroy it. Whenever Diurna plants her staff, she'll also begin hatching 2 different dragon eggs, but you're allowed to use the ability from her staff 3 times before it expires. Although you technically only need to break the 2 eggs that Diurna is hatching, I'd recommend using your 3rd laser beam to break an additional egg, as this will speed up the fight and make it easier overall. It's worth noting that the beam will despawn the moment it breaks a single egg, so you can't get creative and break multiple eggs with one beam. Finally, whenever one of the eggs is broken on Heroic, Diurna will cast Clutch Watcher's Rage, which is a ramping hit on the entire raid for each egg broken within 10 seconds. As long as your healers are prepared for this incoming damage, it shouldn't be an issue. Well, that covers all of Diurna's abilities. As previously mentioned, only half of your raid will be fighting the boss. The other half will be assigned to clear out waves of adds, which will constantly spawn throughout the room. 30 seconds after the fight begins, the first add wave will spawn here, along the wall directly in the center of Diurna's room. Shortly afterwards, another wave of adds will activate along the leftmost side of the room, so the tank will need to kite in that direction in order to make sure all of the new adds get picked up immediately. While all of this is going on, the tank holding Diurna will need to drag her in the opposite direction of the add spawns, since Diurna has a passive effect which causes any nearby adds to regenerate their health very quickly. This means that both the add and the boss groups will need to understand the spawn patterns of the add waves, as you'll need to move Diurna around the room accordingly. As previously mentioned, the first 2 ad sets will always spawn in the middle and on the left side of the room. The 3rd and 4th ad sets will then appear here, on the complete opposite side of the room. The 5th and 6th ads will spawn here on the left, and the 7th and 8th ad sets will spawn on the right. If you can't already tell, the pattern is that you'll get a set of 2 ads on one side of the room, and then after a short delay, another 2 sets of ads will spawn on the other side of the room. This process will repeat indefinitely until all of the eggs are destroyed, so your raid will spend a lot of time zigzagging across the room. As for the adds themselves, I won't discuss every single generic ability, and I will instead focus on the ones that you need to be aware of. Primalist mages will frequently spawn in packs, and they will spam cast Ice Barrage at a random player. While this ability is interruptible, it's usually much more efficient to save AoE stuns for these mages, as this is much easier than manually interrupting each cast. The juvenile Frost Proto-Dragons will deal unavoidable single target damage to the tank and pulsing AoE damage to the raid. As a result, these dragons should be your top kill priority, and every other mob can be cleaved down evenly. Dragonid Stormbringers will cast Static Jolt, which deals heavy damage to the tank and stuns them for 2 seconds. If this interruptible cast is allowed to go off, the tank will be in extreme danger of dying, so it's absolutely crucial that you interrupt every single cast of Static Jolts. Dragonspawn Flamebenders will cast 2 abilities, the first of which is Flame Sentry. This causes multiple fire orbs to spawn nearby, and they'll create a laser beam which rotates in a circle. If one of these things spawns near you, just move away to an empty section of the room and you should be fine. The Flamebenders will also cast Cauterizing Flash Flames, which deals a large chunk of damage to nearby players, and heals all nearby adds for 200% of the damage dealt over 9 seconds. The heal effect from this ability is dispellable, so you should have a priest nearby to mass dispel the mobs after every single cast. Alternatively, if your raid has multiple Blood Elf players, you can rotate casts of Arcane Torrent to easily negate this ability. Terrasec Earthweavers will cast Tremors, which deals damage in a frontal cone and stuns anyone hit for 4 seconds. Tanks need to make sure that this ability is always faced towards the wall, as the frontal cone has a surprisingly large range. Finally, if the team assigned to Broodkeeper Diurna fails to break an egg before it hatches, a nascent proto-dragon will emerge from the egg. Despite their intimidating appearance, these dragons have no special abilities and will simply auto-attack the tank. As a result, it's not the end of the world if one of these things spawns, but you will need to have a DPS player taunt the dragon away from Diurna, as otherwise it'll be affected by her health regeneration aura. Once the DPS player drags it towards the other half of the raid, the tank assigned to the ad waves can taunt the dragon and stack it up with the rest of the ads. Once every single egg has been destroyed, Diurna will begin her final phase. At the start of the phase, Diurna gains a 15% damage buff, and she'll gain an additional stack of this buff every 30 seconds until she dies. The boss also gets upgraded versions of all of her abilities, but notably, she completely loses her healing aura. This means that any remaining ads should be dragged on top of Diurna and cleaved down. As for the ability changes, Wildfire will now drop 2 AoE swirlies instead of 1, which just means you'll need to spend a bit more time dodging before you can return to hitting the boss. Mortal Stoneclaws will now apply an even longer healing reduction debuff to the tank. This may sound scary, but during the second phase of the fight, you'll actually be able to taunt swap whenever the debuff goes out, since your other tank no longer needs to worry about rounding up ads. Frozen Shroud receives the most significant upgrade, as it now causes an attackable chunk of ice to spawn at the feet of every single player, which roots them in place. The moment Frozen Shroud is cast, everyone in your raid should be prepared to slam a heavy-hitting AoE ability, as this will generally result in most of the icy bindings being instantly broken. The final change during this phase is to Diurna's staff, which is no longer something that players can interact with. Instead, Diurna will randomly select multiple players and cause a laser beam to chase after them for a few seconds. If you find yourself targeted by this laser beam, just run out of the raid so that nobody else gets hit. As you can probably tell, the final phase of Broodkeeper Diurna isn't really mechanically intensive, so it mostly boils down to being a damage and healing race to kill the boss before she kills you. That being said, the difficulty of this damage check will vary wildly depending on how much health Diurna has when the final egg is destroyed. For instance, during my guild's recent reclears, we've been getting Diurna down all the way to 2% HP before breaking the final egg, and this is done after consistently breaking 3 eggs on every set. While this effectively removes the entire second phase of the fight, since Diurna will die mere seconds after the final egg is destroyed, you won't be able to reliably do this on your first kill. While we were still progging this boss, my guild chose to only clear the 2 required eggs for the final few staff activations, as this gave us much more time in phase 1 to damage Diurna. Even after all of the eggs had been destroyed, we still entered the final phase at around 20% HP, which meant we still needed to properly handle all of the phase 2 mechanics. How exactly your guild chooses to handle this will vary depending on your damage output, but it's usually safe to say that spending more time in phase 1 to get a shorter phase 2 will make it much easier for you to kill Diurna. Now we can finally discuss Raszageth, the final boss within Vault of the Incarnates. Just like Diurna, you'll need to split your raid into 2 evenly sized groups before the fight begins, as the first intermission will require you to clear out 2 different platforms at the exact same time. At the start of the fight, tanks should spin the boss around while everyone else stands close to her butt. Shortly after the pull starts, Raszageth will cast Electrified Jaws, and this is the main tank buster mechanic for most of the fight. In addition to dealing a large amount of damage to the current tank, it makes them take increased damage from Raszageth's auto attacks. For this reason, you should try to taunt the moment this gets applied to your co-tank in order to ensure they don't get demolished by subsequent auto attacks. The most important mechanic of phase 1 is Static Charge. This will apply a large blue circle to 3 randomly selected DPS or healers, and you'll need to run to the edges of the room to drop this debuff off away from the raid. When the debuff expires, it'll explode and deal fall-off damage to your group, so it's important that everyone shifts away from the debuffed players in order to reduce their damage taken. Upon expiration, the static charges will also leave behind puddles in the ground, and you'll need to use these to negate the knockback from Raszageth's Hurricane Wing. If you're not standing inside of a puddle when Hurricane Wing is cast, you'll be sent flying off of the platform. As you can see in this footage, we have 1 person assigned to always drop their puddle behind Raszageth. This allows your melee DPS to maintain 100% uptime while Hurricane Wing is active, which will make phase 1 much easier in the long run. Throughout this phase, Raszageth will also periodically cast Lightning Breath, but this mechanic is really basic. When cast, she'll turn towards a randomly selected player and fire a laser beam in their direction after a few seconds. If you stand inside of the beam, you'll die pretty much instantly, but as long as you're paying attention, you should have time to move out of the way. The final phase 1 mechanic is Volatile Current. After a short cast, Raszageth causes an AoE explosion at each player's location, and this leaves behind an ad called a Volatile Spark. These ads will begin casting Burst, which deals heavy raid-wide damage if it's allowed to go off. In order to kill off the spark, you'll have to interrupt its cast once on normal and twice on heroic. Thankfully, any AoE CCs, including stuns, knockbacks, purges, and, of course, interrupts, will prevent the sparks from casting. In order to reliably handle this mechanic, you'll need to make sure that your raid is loosely stacked when the sparks are spawning. This will make it very easy to clear out large chunks of sparks using AoE stuns, and any single target CC abilities such as interrupts can be used to kill off whatever's left over. Once Raszageth reaches 65% HP, she'll fly into the air, become immune to damage, and begin the first intermission. As previously mentioned, you should have divided your raid into 2 separate groups before the fight began, and one group will be going to the left while the other is going to the right. I always tank the right platform when my guild kills Raszageth, so that's what I'll be showcasing in this footage. That said, both platforms are functionally identical in terms of mechanics. After a short cast, Raszageth knocks everyone off the center circle, and you'll want to position yourself in such a way that you get launched onto your assigned platform. On each of these platforms, there are 3 big wind elementals, and if you break one of their absorb shields, 7 primalist adds are summoned. This will also cause the wind elemental to stop its channel and begin attacking the tank. While you should try to slowly kite these adds in the direction of the next wind elemental, it's important that you kill off all of them before you actually attack the next elemental. As for the specific abilities cast by each add, the wind elemental will grant all nearby enemies 100% additional haste as long as it's still alive, which means it should be your top kill priority. The add will also debuff multiple players with Surging Blast, and when this expires, the affected players will explode and deal moderate damage to anyone standing nearby. Obviously, if you get hit with this debuff, you should run away from the raid until it goes off. The other 2 generic Primalist adds are Oathsworn Vanguards and Stormseeker Acolytes. The Vanguards are super basic. They'll auto-attack the tank, and the longer they stay alive, the more damage they'll deal. A good tank should be able to survive the hits from these guys for quite a while, but you should still try to kill them off as quickly as possible. The Acolytes are a bit more annoying, as they'll constantly spam Stormbolt casts on random players in your raid. This means it's extremely hard to kite the Acolytes around the room unless you have a Death Knight or a ridiculous amount of ranged interrupts. If possible, you should try to round up all of the Acolytes and burst them down during an AoE stun chain. If you're unable to do this, just make sure that ranged players are throwing out kicks on the Acolytes so that they properly chase after the tank. While all of this is going on, Raszageth will teleport between the 2 platforms and cast Lightning Devastation at the raid. For simplicity's sake, I'll be referring to this mechanic as Deep Breath, since that's basically what it is. You can tell the direction that she's going to breathe based on where she's facing after her teleport. This mechanic will one-shot anyone that gets hit, so I'd recommend being extremely careful where you stand. Once all 3 wind elementals have been killed on each side, your raid can hop into the teleporter and reunite on the 4th platform. After a few seconds, Raszageth will teleport over to meet you, and she'll immediately lose her damage immunity. This marks the start of Phase 2, which is by far the most difficult part of the fight. Once Raszageth fully lands and finishes her short RP speech, she'll immediately cast Storm Surge. When this ability is cast, Raszageth gains a large absorb shield and she debuffs everyone in your raid with either a plus or a minus. If you come into contact with someone of the opposite mark, you both receive a nasty dot. But if you stand near somebody with the same mark, you both get a 200% increase to your damage and healing. To make this mechanic a bit easier, we had our entire raid spread out, and then once the marks were applied, anyone with a positive stopped moving entirely. This made it much easier for the negatives to move around, and they all formed a giant stack underneath the boss. Once it became safe to move, anyone with a positive debuff would run around Raszageth until the entire raid managed to group up. While this movement is quite important, since you want to ensure that the opposite debuffs don't collide, you will need to be quick about it. The damage check on Raszageth's Storm Surge shield is incredibly tight, and if you fail to break it in time, your raid will receive a really nasty dot, which will almost always lead to a wipe. Throughout the second phase of the fight, you'll get 3 casts of Storm Surge, and in between each one, Raszageth will cast 4 additional abilities. 2 of them are Electrified Jaws, the tank buster from earlier, and Volatile Spark, the adds that you need to interrupt. Both mechanics are identical to their Phase 1 counterparts. One of the new mechanics in Phase 2 is Tempest Wing, which is a large ring that radiates out from Raszageth. When it collides with the player, it drags them towards the edge of the room and deals heavy ticking damage every half second. It's crucial that you run to the center of the room as quickly as possible in order to escape the ring's pull. Abilities like Chi Torpedo, Heroic Leap, Death's Advance, or Grappling Hook will help you easily negate this mechanic, but not every class has such high mobility. In order to ensure that everyone in our raid quickly escaped Tempest Wing, we planned out a rotation of Stampeding Roars and Windrush totems. Unless Tempest Wing is severely nerfed in the future, it's highly likely that your guild will need to do the same, as otherwise certain classes will simply end up taking way too much damage before they can escape the ring. The final Phase 2 mechanic is Fulminating Charge, and just like in Phase 1, 3 players will receive a large blue AoE. You should still have all debuffed players run to the edges of the room, but this version of the mechanic won't leave behind a puddle. Instead, the debuff will jump to anyone else that gets hit, albeit with a slightly less powerful effect. If you do this mechanic correctly, no jumps should happen at all, but if somebody does get clipped, they also need to run away from the raid as quickly as possible. After finishing the third cast of Storm Surge, Raszageth will begin the second intermission. This will also trigger if you manage to push her to 25% health before the third Storm Surge. At this point, Raszageth will once again fly into the air, become immune to damage, and following a bit of RP, she spawns 2 big air elementals. On normal mode, she'll only spawn 1 elemental, which makes the intermission significantly easier. On Heroic, we again split our raid in half, and we use the same groups from the first intermission to deal with each elemental. The elemental's primary mechanic is Ball Lightning, which is a bullet hell ability that works just like the one in Kurog Grimtotem's Ice Phase. After 20 seconds, the elementals cast Stormbreak, which causes them to swap places and spawn a bunch of Seeking Stormling adds at their previous location. Tanks need to quickly taunt the new big elemental so that their co-tank doesn't get blasted from a distance. All DPS players need to immediately swap onto the Stormlings and kill them before they reach the opposite elemental. CC abilities such as Ring of Peace are fantastic for this mechanic, as it allows you to keep the little adds grouped up underneath the big air elemental. Throughout this phase, Raszageth will once again cast Deep Breath at the raid, so you need to be careful to avoid that while also maximizing your uptime and dodging the Ball Lightnings. It's a pretty hectic intermission, but once both elementals have been killed, Raszageth will land back on the ground. Note that she still takes no damage at this point, so there's no benefit to attacking her. After a short cast, she'll hit your raid with a massive knockback, and you should position yourselves in such a way that you get launched back onto the Phase 1 platform. Raszageth will then fly over and begin the final phase. During this phase, Raszageth will continue to use the Tempest Wing and Fulminating Charge abilities from Phase 2, aka the ring that pushes you backwards or the blue circles that bounce to anyone they hit. She also regains Thunder Breath from Phase 1, and while it's still mostly easy to manage, it has one new interaction which I'll discuss shortly. You've probably noticed by now that the edges of the room are covered in lightning, and as the fight goes on, this lightning will expand towards the center of the platform. Effectively, this serves as the softened rage of the fight, as you need to defeat Raszageth before the entire platform is blanketed in lightning. One of the 2 new abilities in Phase 3 is Thunderous Blast, which is a new tank swap mechanic that replaces Electrified Jaws. This is a full nature damage channel onto the tank, and when it finishes, the tank explodes and deals damage to the entire raid. The damage of this explosion will vary depending on how much damage the tank received, so you should use as many defensives or externals as possible in order to minimize your damage taken. This explosion will also apply a nasty debuff to anyone standing near the tank, so they should move away in order to ensure that nobody in the raid is hit. The final mechanic of the fight is Magnetic Charge. This debuff gets applied to a random DPS or healer, and after 8 seconds, it'll explode and deal fall-off damage to the entire raid. Additionally, all members of your raid will get gripped on top of the debuffed player. We had the person affected by Magnetic Charge run to one side of the room, and then everyone else position themselves on the opposite side of the room. Just be careful in the case that this mechanic overlaps with Lightning Breath, as getting gripped through the breath will kill you instantly. Once the grip finishes, the entire raid should reposition and prepare for the next Tempest Wing or Fulminating Charge. From here, Raszageth will repeat her abilities endlessly, and the fight turns into a race to kill her before you get overwhelmed by the lightning. The next raid in the rotation is Aberrus the Shadowed Crucible, and it'll be active during weeks 2 and 5. Once again, I'll begin by discussing the first boss of the raid, Kazzara the Hellforged. Kazzara's primary mechanic is Dread Rifts. This debuff will target a few random players, and after 5 seconds it'll explode, dealing damage to anyone nearby and leaving behind a patch on the ground. When targeted by this ability, you should drop it towards the edges of the room. Kazzara will also cast Rays of Anguish, which are laser beams that will chase after random players. On normal difficulty, these beams will eventually despawn, but on heroic difficulty, you'll need to manually kite the beam into one of the Dread Rift puddles on the ground. This will cause both the beam and the rift to disappear. When Kazzara reaches 80, 60, and 40% health, she'll deal a large burst of damage to the raid and shatter a portion of her armor, causing AoE swirlies to appear throughout the room. Healers should watch the boss's health to prepare for this damage spike, and DPS players should try to save their personal defensives to help out the healers. For tanks, the only mechanic you need to worry about is Terror Claws, which is a heavy-hitting tank buster cast by Kazzara once every 30 seconds. This ability deals high physical damage, low shadow damage, and leaves behind a debuff on the tank. You should taunt off your co-tank after they receive 1 stack of this debuff. Kazzara has 2 final abilities. Wings of Extinction is a moderate burst of raid-wide damage that pushes everyone back. It also leaves behind a nasty dot on the raid that your healers will need to deal with. Lastly, Kazzara will turn towards a random player and cast Hellbeam. This is pretty easy to deal with because if you notice she's facing you, you can just step to the side and avoid her Hellbeam. If you don't move and you get hit by the beam, you'll die very quickly. As a final note, while fighting Kazzara, you should probably use Bloodlust on pull, but you can also save it for the last 40% of the fight if you find that your group is struggling to meet the healing check. Next up, I'll discuss the Amalgamation Chamber, which is one of the choices you'll have for your second boss. Before the fight begins, you'll need to divide your raid into 2 equally sized groups. This is because the initial phase of the encounter involves fighting 2 different mini-bosses, which need to be tanked on opposite sides of the room. As the fight goes on, each of these bosses will apply a stacking debuff to all nearby players, which deals moderate ticking damage. In the case of the Shadow boss, it also reduces your maximum health. This debuff can be really nasty if it reaches high stacks, so I'd recommend having everyone in your raid, except for the tanks, switch to the opposite boss at around 10 to 13 stacks. If you remain far enough away from one of the bosses for over 20 seconds, all of your stacks for that associated debuff will fall off. Since tanks can easily survive high stacks, they should stay on the same side for all of Phase 1 just to make sure that the boss positioning doesn't get screwed up. Each of these bosses has a set of mechanics that they'll use during Phase 1. The Eternal Blaze will fire off a few lava tornadoes at a random player, and these need to be avoided. It'll also cast Fiery Meteor, which is a large swirly circle that deals less damage the more people stand inside of it. When this goes out, everyone in your raid's fire group should help soak it. On Heroic difficulty, the Blaze will also cast Molten Eruption, which is a series of smaller AoE circles around the room. Each of these circles must be soaked by a single player, or the raid will take heavy damage. The Shadow boss also has 3 abilities, the first of which is Umbral Detonation. This debuff targets a few random players, causing them to explode after 6 seconds and leave a puddle on the ground. If you get targeted by this, run to the edges of the room to drop off your puddle. The Shadow boss will also cast Coalescing Void, which causes a large purple orb to appear. After a few seconds, this orb will explode and deal heavy damage to the raid, but the damage is lessened the further away you are from the orb. When it appears, your entire raid should run away, and when it explodes, your tank should drag the boss back to where it was before. Finally, on Heroic difficulty, the boss will cast Shadow's Convergence, which causes multiple small purple orbs to collapse inwards towards the boss's location. Look for an opening in between the purple balls and move through it to avoid taking any damage. For tanks, nothing too special happens during this phase. The Fire and Shadow bosses have mini tank busters called Flame Slash and Shadow Spike, respectively, but these abilities won't force you to do any tank swaps. Once both bosses reach 50% health, they'll become immune and a new boss, the Shadow Flame Amalgamation, will appear. You should use Bloodlust the moment the Amalgamation becomes attackable. Your raid also no longer needs to be split up, and they should meet in the center of the room to fight this boss together. As the phase progresses, everyone will receive increasing stacks of Shadow Flame Contamination, which deals heavy ticking damage and reduces your maximum health by 1% per stack. This is the softened rage of the fight, as you'll need to finish the boss before your stacks get too high. The first thing I'll address in this phase are the tank mechanics, as unlike before, you actually have a tank swap. The boss will first cast Withering Vulnerability, which deals massive physical damage to the current tank, and makes them take 200% increased Shadow Flame damage for 10 seconds. Once this goes out, the other tank should immediately taunt, as the Amalgamation will follow up with a cone of shadow damage aimed at the current tank. Throughout this phase, you should have one tank assigned to get hit with Withering Vulnerability, while the other tank taunts off for Shadow Flame Burst. The boss has 3 additional mechanics during this phase, and each one is a fusion of the spells from Phase 1 of the encounter. For instance, Gloom Conflagration will cause a large meteor circle to appear on the tank, and your raid should stand in it to split the incoming damage. Immediately after this soak goes off, a purple orb will appear that your raid should run away from. Just like in Phase 1, when it explodes, you'll take less damage the further away you are from it. Blistering Twilight is a debuff applied to multiple players, and, as usual, this drops a puddle and should be taken to the edges of the room. When the debuff expires, each player will also fire off a series of lava waves that everyone needs to avoid. Finally, on Heroic difficulty, the boss will cast Convergent Eruption. This causes multiple soak circles to appear throughout the room, and one person will need to stand inside of each circle. As soon as each circle gets soaked, the boss will fire an AoE swirly at your location, so you'll need to move quickly to avoid being hit. This phase may seem pretty complicated, but provided you handle all of the soaks properly and kill the boss before your healers get overwhelmed, the fight shouldn't be too tricky. Next up is Assault of the Zaqali, which is the ad fight of the raid. Once again, you'll need to split your raid into 2 separate groups before the fight begins. At the start of the encounter, you'll briefly attack Warlord Cagney, who is effectively the main boss in this fight. While you will be engaging a lot of different smaller enemies during Assault of the Zaqali, you need to prioritize dealing damage to Warlord Cagney whenever possible, as killing him is the only way to end the encounter. As for Bloodlust, some groups may choose to use it on pull, but during the first few weeks of the raid, I'd recommend holding it until the end of the fight. 30 seconds after the fight begins, Cagney will cause piles of rubble to appear on the ground before he becomes immune to damage and leaps away. At this point, your raid should split up into their pre-assigned groups, with one running to a balcony at the far end of the hallway, while the other runs onto the balcony near the entrance. The group near the entrance should be the one to pick up the first pile of rubble on the floor. This rubble is used to kill off certain adds which climb up the wall throughout the fight. You won't be able to kill off every add just by dropping rubble on them, but by getting rid of a few guards or huntsmen, it should make it easier for your raid to not get overwhelmed. Warlord Cagney will spawn additional pieces of rubble throughout the fight, so you should have a few players pre-assigned to grab these and knock the adds off the wall. Speaking of the adds, there are 4 different types which you'll encounter. Wall climbers are generic mobs that have no special abilities. However, tanks still need to pick them up, as the wall climbers will try to run to the doorway in the center of the room, and if they manage to reach it and attack it, they'll trigger an ability called Barrier Backfire. If this goes off, it effectively kills your entire raid. As long as tanks don't let any of these guys slip through, you should be fine. Next up, the Obsidian Guards and Flamebound Huntsmen are slightly stronger than the average wall climber. The Huntsman will fire AoE swirlies at nearby players, while the Guard will target a random player with a rectangular AoE blast. If you get targeted by this blast, you won't be able to avoid it, so just stand still and let the rest of your raid move away. Neither the Guards nor the Huntsmen are particularly dangerous, so they should be cleaved down along with the wall climbers. The truly dangerous add in this fight is the Magma Mystic, and this should always be your top kill priority. Shortly after spawning, these Mystics will cast Molten Barrier, causing them to gain a massive Absorb Shield which deals ramping pulsing damage to the raid until it's broken. As you might expect, breaking this Absorb Shield is your #1 priority, as otherwise the damage will quickly kill off your raid. Once the Mystic Shield is broken, they'll shoot out interruptible lava bolts at random players in the raid, and these should be kicked whenever possible. Finally, throughout this phase, Warlord Cagney will leap between each of the 2 platforms, and he must be picked up by the tank the moment he lands. Cagney's landing also sends out a series of AoE swirlies that need to be avoided. The boss will periodically cast Heavy Cudgel, which is a massive cone aimed at the tank. This deals heavy physical damage and increases the tank's physical damage taken by 15% for 45 seconds. This debuff can stack, so tanks should save their best defensives for when they have 2 stacks of Heavy Cudgel. Finally, tanks should make sure Cagney is faced away from the raid, so nobody else gets hit by Heavy Cudgel. After Warlord Cagney reaches 25% health, he'll run towards the center of the hallway and start the final phase. Almost immediately, he'll cast Desperate Immolation, which causes him to be healed for 10% of his maximum health over a few seconds. This heal is affected by Mortal Strike or other healing reduction debuffs, so you should try to make sure Cagney has one of these effects on him before he moves into the final phase. As mentioned before, this is a good place to use your Bloodlust if you didn't already cast it on Pull. Throughout this phase, Cagney only uses 2 abilities, the first of which is Flaming Cudgel. This is mostly identical to the aforementioned Heavy Cudgel ability, but this one has a new addition. After the cone hits the tank, everyone in the raid will explode and deal fire damage to anyone within 6 yards of them. Because of this, your raid must be spread out during Flaming Cudgel, as getting hit by multiple fire explosions will almost certainly result in your death. As usual, the tank should aim this cone away from the raid. Finally, Cagney will target the nearby door with a Catastrophic Slam, and your raid must stand inside of this ability to split the incoming damage. On Heroic, this slam will also apply a debuff which increases your damage taken from Catastrophic Slam by 200%, so after you soak one of them, you probably won't be able to soak another. For this reason, on Heroic, you should only have half of your raids soak each slam, and to make it really simple, you can just use the same assignments from the platforms in Phase 1. Also, it's really important that nobody misses this soak, as Cagney will cause a Barrier Backfire if there aren't enough people in it to split the damage. Next, we'll take a look at the Forgotten Experiments, which is unlocked after you defeat the Amalgamation Chamber. In this encounter, you'll fight 3 different bosses, one after another, and the first you'll engage is Neldris. Neldris' primary mechanic is Rending Charge. This will target multiple players, and after a few seconds, Neldris will charge to them, dealing heavy damage and applying a bleed. This charge will also hit anyone standing in between Neldris or the targeted player, so it's important that you run away from the raid if Neldris selects you for Rending Charge. Neldris will also periodically cast Bellowing Roar, which is a raid-wide AoE that deals less damage the further away from it you are. Finally, Massive Slam is a large AoE cone targeted at a random player. When the cone appears, everyone in your raid should run out of it. It's pretty straightforward. While that covers most of Neldris' unique mechanics, I want to quickly touch upon the tank ability before discussing the other 2 bosses in this fight. Infuse Strikes is a debuff that will be applied to the tank whenever they receive an auto attack from one of the bosses. This is a mechanic that all 3 bosses in this fight will use, and it's the primary thing that tanks need to worry about. This debuff will stack indefinitely as you take more auto attacks, and the only way to clear it is by coming into contact with another player that also has the Infused Strikes debuff. What this means in practice is that one tank will hold the boss until they reach roughly 6 to 8 stacks, at which point the other tank will taunt. The second tank will then get 1 stack of Infused Strikes, and both tanks will touch each other to clear off the debuff. This causes the raid to be hit with a pulse of damage that leaves behind a dot called Infused Explosion. This dot lasts for 20 seconds, and until it expires, the tank should not clear off their Infused Strike debuffs again. Once the raid finishes off Neldris, Thadrion will join the fight. Throughout this phase, multiple players will receive a debuff called Unstable Essence, which is a dot that deals ramping damage the longer it stays on a player. When it gets dispelled, the dot will immediately jump to a nearby player, and an ad called an Erratic Remnant will spawn. These remnants deal pulsing damage to the raid and must be killed off immediately. Thadrion also has a mechanic called Violent Eruption, which is an 8-second channel that deals pulsing damage to the raid. If any Erratic Remnant ads are alive while Thadrion is channeling this ability, they'll begin pulsing massive additional damage onto the raid, which usually results in a wipe. For this reason, it's absolutely crucial that you never dispel Unstable Essence before Violent Eruption goes out. Since the damage dealt by Unstable Essence will slowly ramp up over time, healers shouldn't be in any rush to dispel it. Additionally, the fact that it immediately jumps to another player and spawns an Erratic Remnant ad means you're actively punished for dispelling this debuff too often. I'd recommend completely ignoring these debuffs until after the Violent Eruption cast finishes, at which point healers can safely dispel all of them. This will give your DPS plenty of time to kill off the Unstable Essences before Thadrion casts Violent Eruption once again. Finally, Thadrion will also cast Volatile Spew, which just fires off a few AoE swirlies across the room. Just avoid these and you should be fine. After Thadrion is killed, the final boss of the encounter, Rionthus, will appear. I'd recommend using your Bloodlust after this boss spawns. During his phase, he'll repeatedly cast Disintegrate at a few randomly selected players. If you get targeted by this ability, you'll deal splash damage to any players standing nearby, so you should run out of the raid to prevent this from happening. Throughout the fight, Rionthus will also summon temporal anomaly orbs at the edges of the room that'll slowly move towards him. If an orb reaches Rionthus, he'll gain a shield for 15% of his maximum health, which is obviously not something you want to happen. Thankfully, if a player runs into this orb, it'll collide with them, dealing a bit of damage and bouncing in the other direction. While DPS players can technically help bounce the orb, you should probably have the tanks handle it when they aren't actively holding Rionthus. That being said, if the fight goes on for too long, you'll need to begin bouncing multiple anomalies at once, and that'll likely require the DPS to help out. Finally, Rionthus will periodically leap into the air and begin casting Deep Breath. This is a large rectangular AoE that crosses the entire room, and if you get hit by it, you'll probably die. If you see that Rionthus is about to cast this, look up and check to find which section of the room he's about to hit. Then, just quickly move to an area that's safe. After he finishes his first Deep Breath, Rionthus will immediately leap to a new location and begin to breathe a second time, so you need to be ready to move ASAP if he jumps over to your section of the room. After 2 deep breaths, Rionthus will land and the fight will continue until you kill him or he kills you. Rashok the Elder is the next boss we'll be discussing, and his mechanics are quite simple when compared to the last few. The main mechanic that he'll cast throughout the fight is Searing Slam. This will target a random player, and after a few seconds, Rashok will leap towards their location, deal heavy damage to the entire raid, and leave behind a lava puddle on the ground wherever he lands. As you might expect, players targeted with Searing Slam should always run to the edges of the room in order to drop off their lava puddles. However, it's absolutely crucial that you don't stand too close to an existing lava puddle, as Rashok will immediately wipe the raid if 2 puddles are touching. The hitbox on this is pretty unforgiving, so I'd recommend always putting a safe distance between yourself and any nearby puddles if you get targeted by Searing Slam. As a final note, these puddles will periodically shoot out lava waves that your raid will need to avoid. Rashok's next ability is Doom Flames, which fires off multiple circles around the room that need to be soaked by a single player. He has another ability, Charge Smash, which is a split damage soak centered around the tank that your entire raid should stand in. On Heroic, this will also leave behind a nasty dot. Rashok will also sometimes cast Shadow Lava Blast, which is a large AoE cone aimed in the direction of a random player. Finally, there are 2 additional abilities that tanks will need to be aware of. Rashok has a Tank Buster combo which consists of 2 abilities, Flaming Slash and Earthen Crush. During his combo, Rashok will cast one of these abilities a single time, and he'll cast the other ability twice. If one tank is hit by the same ability 2 times in one combo, they'll take 3000% increased damage and, well, die. Because of this, you should only taunt Rashok when your co-tank is about to be hit by a duplicate ability in the combo. Even if you handle this mechanic properly, it'll still deal a massive amount of damage, so it's crucial that you save major defensive cooldowns for every single combo. Rashok's final mechanic involves his energy bar, which will slowly increase as the fight progresses. If he reaches 100 energy, he'll instantly wipe the raid, which is why you need to use the conduit in the center of the room to drain energy from Rashok. To start this process, tanks will need to kite Rashok through the center of the room, and you should only do this when he's around 95 energy. This causes Rashok to be stunned for 30 seconds, during which time your raid can freely damage him. However, healers will still need to work overtime, as the boss will be pulsing ramping damage onto the entire raid. Additionally, lines of AoE swirlies will fire out from the center of the room, and players will need to avoid this. After Rashok's energy has been fully drained, he'll do a light amount of raid-wide damage before returning to Phase 1. The conduit can only be used to drain Rashok's energy twice during the fight, after which it'll break and become unusable. From that point on, you'll need to race to finish off Rashok before he reaches 100 energy and wipes your raid. As a final note, you could use Bloodlust for the conduit phases if your healers are struggling with it, but you'll probably want to use it on pull to maximize your damage. Ultimately, this decision is up to your raid leader. After defeating both Rashok and the Forgotten Experiments, you can fight Zskarn, the Vigilant Steward. The most important thing to understand about Zskarn is that the floor tiles in his room are actually part of the encounter. Throughout the fight, Zskarn will frequently cast Dragonfire traps, causing the 2 tiles nearest him to activate and be covered with fire. This means the tanks will need to carefully position the boss along the wall and kite him around when the tiles become active. Melee DPS will need to be especially careful when attacking Zskarn, as standing in an active tile will cause you to take a ton of damage. This isn't the only way in which the traps will activate though, as Zskarn will also summon adds called Dragonfire Golems. These golems will run around the room and attempt to activate additional traps, which you really don't want to happen. DPS players should try to kill these golems ASAP while they're active, and you can also use crowd control abilities like stuns, slows, grips, or knockbacks to ensure the golems don't activate any traps before they die. Once a golem has been defeated, you can loot its body to receive a salvage part, which is an extra action button that allows you to disable an active trap. While you should try to prioritize disabling traps that are in inconvenient spots, the only thing that really matters is you use every spare part before it expires, as it's always nice to have less traps active in the room. For tanks, this fight will be a little bit tricky, as you have a few things you need to worry about. First, Zskarn will toss multiple shrapnel bombs throughout the room, and tanks need to run on top of these to soak the blast before the bomb blows up on the entire raid. Generally speaking, these bombs will instantly kill DPS players if they accidentally walk over it. However, during testing we found out that if DPS players have an immunity, they could help soak some of these bombs. I wouldn't recommend relying on this strategy, but it's important to know that it exists. While one tank is busy clearing out shrapnel bombs, the other will need to hold Zskarn and handle his Searing Claws. This is a stacking fire debuff that gets applied to the current tank every time they're hit with one of Zskarn's auto attacks. You should aim the taunt swap on Zskarn at around 7 to 10 stacks, but the exact amount isn't very important. As long as all of the shrapnel bombs are clear, and all of your stacks of Searing Claws have expired, you should be safe to taunt Zskarn. As the fight goes on, your tanks will take turns handling shrapnel bombs and moving Zskarn around the room. Throughout the fight, Zskarn will also cast Blast Wave, which is a heavy hit on the raid that pushes all players away from him. It's important to be mindful of your positioning when Blast Wave is about to go out, as you don't want to accidentally get pushed into a Dragonfire trap or a Shrapnel Bomb. On Heroic, he'll also apply Unstable Embers to multiple players, which is a dot that explodes after 10 seconds and deals bonus damage to anyone standing nearby. I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but if you get this debuff, you should run out of the raid so you don't hit anyone else. Thankfully, this one doesn't drop a puddle or anything of the sort, you just need to stand 5 yards away from other players. The final mechanic of Zskarn's fight is Tactical Destruction. This causes some of the nearby dragon statues along the wall to glow before pulsing fire damage in a large area. Each statue will fire off multiple fire pulses in a row, which will increase in size every time until the pulse reaches the center of the room. If anyone gets hit by this pulse, they'll die immediately, so running away from the active statues is your top priority. Something that isn't communicated by the journal is that every time Zskarn casts Tactical Destruction, an additional dragon statue will begin pulsing fire. The first cast only affects 2 statues, but the second will affect 3 statues, and so on. This mechanic, along with the Dragonfire traps, is the softened rage of the fight, as active statues during Tactical Destruction mean you'll have very little space in the room to hide. Because of how impactful this mechanic is, it effectively dictates how you deal with everything else in the encounter. When Tactical Destruction activates, the entire raid will need to run to the opposite side of the room, and tanks will need to quickly reposition Zskarn against the far wall. If you don't do this fast enough, he may activate traps in the middle of the room, which gives you less space to work with. Also, because you won't be able to attack the golems while tactical destruction is going off, it's crucial that your DPS kill them the moment they spawn. If you delay killing a golem for too long, tactical destruction may force you to run away from it, allowing the golem to freely activate multiple traps while you're stuck on the opposite side of the room. As you can probably tell, Zskarn is a very chaotic fight that'll likely be the first major wall for many guilds. Before fighting him, your raid should work out a plan for how they want to move the boss around the room, as this means you'll likely need to do less thinking on the fly. If you manage to get the movement down and deal with the golems efficiently, Zskarn should fall over. The next boss you'll encounter is Magmorax, and this is the classic Sludgefist style damage and healing check for the raid. The main ability he'll cast throughout the fight is Molten Spittle, which is a debuff applied to multiple random players. When it expires, the affected players will explode, dealing damage to anyone nearby and dropping a puddle on the ground. Unlike many other abilities, you don't necessarily want to run to the edge of the room with this debuff. The puddle that it creates will slowly grow in size over time unless players are standing inside of it. As more people stand inside of these puddles, they'll begin to shrink until they disappear entirely. However, doing this will cause you to gain stacks of Searing Heat, which is a nasty fire dot that lasts for 15 seconds. If you let this buff reach 25 stacks, it'll kill you instantly, though the ticking damage will likely already become lethal even if you let it reach 10 stacks. The best way to handle this mechanic is to drop the puddles just far enough away from Magmorax so that he doesn't get hit. If the boss touches a magma puddle, he'll begin to cast Blazing Tantrum, which effectively causes a wipe. By dropping the puddles just out of range of him, your DPS can quickly clear them without losing too much uptime on the boss. It's important that you let your Searing Heat stacks fully expire before you try to soak another puddle, as otherwise your stacks will be fully refreshed and you'll begin to take a lot of damage. As long as no puddles are dropped beneath the boss and everyone in your raid helps soak them, this mechanic shouldn't be too difficult. As a final note, when Magmorax is about to die, you can probably justify dropping the puddles on the opposite side of the room, as they'll take quite a while to expand across the entire platform. While these puddles are the most important part of the fight, there are still other mechanics that you need to be aware of. Magmorax will periodically cast Igniting Roar, which deals heavy raid-wide damage and causes multiple individual soak circles to appear throughout the room. Every single one of these circles needs to be soaked, as otherwise they'll deal massive damage to the raid and form an additional puddle, which is really, really bad. That being said, after soaking one of these puddles, you'll take 150 additional damage from them for 1 minute, which means you can't help soak 2 Igniting Roars in a row. As long as people do musical chairs properly and don't double up on a single soak, you should have more than enough people to cover every Igniting Roar. Magmorax has another ability called Blazing Breath, which is a massive cone aimed at a random player. If you're standing too far away from Magmorax, it may be difficult to avoid this cone, so you should always try to stand somewhat close to him even if you're a ranged DPS or a healer. Magmorax's final regular ability is Overpowering Stomp, which deals heavy damage to the raid and sends everyone flying away from him. The knockback effect on this ability is really powerful, and there aren't any walls that you can put your back to. While many classes such as Death Knights, Monks, and Demon Hunters can simply negate the knockback, classes like Priest and Paladin will struggle to deal with it. Ideally, you should have other ways to handle this knockback, such as a rescue from a friendly evoker or a well-timed Warlock gateway, but if you're out of options, you'll just need to make sure that you're standing in a location that doesn't send you flying into the lava. Additionally, if there's any active magma puddles in the room, make sure you don't get knocked into one and accidentally refresh your Searing Heat stacks. Magmorax's tank mechanic is Incinerating Maws, and this is thankfully pretty easy to deal with. It deals heavy physical damage to the current tank spread out across 3 different hits, and leaves behind a stacking fire dot that lasts for 30 seconds. After one tank has received all 3 hits from a single Incinerating Maw, the other tank should taunt the boss. The final aspect of Magmorax that's worth noting is his Hardened Rage, which happens after he reaches 100 energy. This causes him to cast Catastrophic Eruption, which will kill off your raid very quickly. It takes around 4 to 5 minutes for Magmorax to reach his maximum energy, so you have until then to kill Magmorax before he kills you. Echo of Neltharion is the penultimate boss of the raid, and while he's a decent step up in difficulty, most of his mechanics are pretty easy to understand. At the start of the fight, your entire raid should group up on one side of the room, and your tanks will need to taunt Neltharion over to the rest of the raid. This specific positioning is important because Neltharion will create rock walls which divide the room into 5 different sections. These rock walls can't be crossed by normal means, so if you get stuck in a different section away from your raid, you'll need to wait for a bit to rejoin the fight. Dealing with these rock walls is your primary objective during Phase 1 of the encounter. Neltharion has 2 abilities which directly interact with them, the first one being Rushing Darkness. This ability targets a few randomly selected players in the raid, which you can see indicated by a faint purple line connecting Neltharion and the targeted players. When it goes off, the affected players will take damage and be knocked away from Neltharion, causing them to break any rock walls that they come into contact with. Additionally, anyone standing in between Neltharion and the targeted player will be silenced for 3 seconds. It's important to note that breaking a section of the rock wall will cause you to take a moderate chunk of additional damage, and the entire raid will receive a light dot for every piece of the wall that gets broken. On its own, this dot is fairly trivial, but it can stack up to be really nasty if you break too many pieces of the wall at once. Breaking a wall will also cause AoE swirlies to shoot out across the room, and the raid will need to avoid these. All of that being said, on normal and heroic difficulty, there's actually no reason for DPS players to break a rock wall. Every single time Rushing Darkness goes out, Neltharion will reform the rock walls after a few seconds, making it completely pointless to break them using Rushing Darkness. As a result, you should always aim Rushing Darkness into the walls of the boss arena, as this will allow your group to take less damage, and it means you won't be knocked back quite as far. Everyone else in the raid just needs to avoid standing on top of Rushing Darkness so they don't get silenced for 3 seconds. Neltharion's other ability that interacts with the rock walls is his tank buster, Calamitous Strike. Just like Rushing Darkness, this will deal heavy damage to the tank and knock them back, causing them to break any walls they come into contact with. However, Neltharion won't immediately reform the walls after a tank breaks them, so tanks should use this knockback to open up a path for the raid leading into another section of the room. As you might expect, tanks should taunt the boss immediately after each cast of Calamitous Strike. The reason you'll need to move around the room during this phase is because of Neltharion's next ability, Echoing Fissure. Shortly after hitting the tank with Calamitous Strike, Neltharion will create a fissure at his location that deals massive damage to the entire raid. This damage will be lessened the further away you are from it, so the moment Neltharion begins casting Echoing Fissure, your entire raid should move into the next section of the room. This process will repeat multiple times throughout Phase 1, and every time Neltharion creates a new Echoing Fissure, the old ones will also explode for additional raid damage. This effectively serves as the softened rage of Phase 1, as eventually the fissures will one-shot your raid if you have too many of them active at once. Finally, throughout Phases 1 and 2, Neltharion will cast Volcanic Heart on random players. This debuff is pretty straightforward. Just run it out of the raid and make sure nobody is standing within 15 yards of you when it expires. After Neltharion reaches 70% health, he'll transition into Phase 2, causing him to break and reform all of the walls in the room while dealing pulsing damage to the raid. While the boss is reforming the walls, you should look for orange swirlies on the ground, which indicate where these new walls will appear. Make sure your entire raid moves into one section of the room before the walls are created, as otherwise you'll be cut off from everyone else. In Phase 2, Neltharion will continue to cast Volcanic Heart and Rushing Darkness, but you should handle these abilities in the exact same way as you did during Phase 1. Additionally, there are a few bonus AoE swirlies that your raid will need to avoid, and as the phase progresses, Neltharion will deal ramping pulsing damage to your raid. If you aren't able to end the phase fast enough, Neltharion's AoE pulse will eventually kill you. In order to end this phase, you'll need to defeat the 3 Voices from Beyond ads that appear throughout the room. On normal difficulty, every player can attack these ads, but on heroic it's a little bit more complicated. Neltharion will debuff multiple players in your raid with Corruption, and this causes them to appear hostile and receive damage from friendly player attacks. Be very careful about using heavy-hitting abilities right before Corruption goes out, as you don't want to accidentally kill off a member of your raid. The main advantage of being debuffed with Corruption is that it allows you to attack the Voice from Beyond ads. When these ads spawn, they'll come with a small Absorb shield, and you'll need to break this shield in order to make the ad attackable by the rest of your raid. When the shield is broken, Corruption will be removed from all players, and your entire raid should swap to the vulnerable Voice from Beyond and finish it off. After killing off the first Voice from Beyond, you'll want to move into another section of the room to start killing the second ad, and once again, you'll clear a path through the rock walls by using the Tank Buster. In Phase 2, Neltharion's Tank Buster is called Sunder Shadow, and it works a bit differently than the ability in Phase 1. After Neltharion hits you, you'll take heavy physical damage and your soul will be knocked out of your body. On the tank screen, they'll be in full control over their soul, and this allows them to pass through the rock walls unhindered. On everyone else's screen, the tank's soul will be invisible, and their body will be sat unmoving in front of Neltharion. After a few seconds, Neltharion will deal physical damage to the tank's body and kick it in the direction of the tank's soul. The tank will then take shadow damage equal to their body's missing health, and since they have no control over that, healers should try to fully heal the tank's body before it collides with their soul. Tanks should also try to have major defensives prepared for this, just in case the healers can't top off their body. Finally, any walls that the tank's body passes through as it moves towards the soul will be broken. This is probably the most complicated tank buster ever created, but the TLDR is that after the tank gets hit, they should run through a nearby rock wall so that their body passes through it after it's hit by Neltharion. To make this a little bit easier to line up, the game will connect your soul to your body with a large purple line. Assuming you manage to break the wall properly, the rest of your raid can move through the gap and begin attacking the second voice from beyond. This process will repeat until all 3 voices from beyond are dead, at which point Neltharion will enter his third and final phase. This phase is a pretty straightforward damage burn, and you should always save your bloodlust for this part of the fight. At the start of Phase 3, Neltharion will once again destroy and reform every rock wall in the room, and he'll continue to cast Rushing Darkness and Calamitous Strike, which was the tank buster from Phase 1. As usual, Rushing Darkness should be aimed into the wall, but in this phase, you should also aim Calamitous Strike into the wall. During Neltharion's final phase, it is actively detrimental to break any rock walls, as he'll frequently turn a set number of them into patches of Sundered Reality. These patches will spew out an endless supply of Twisted Aberration adds, which do nothing outside of auto-attacking the tanks. However, these aberrations will deal increasing damage the longer they stay alive, so your DPS will need to kill them off before the tanks get overwhelmed. These Sundered Reality patches are also important for dealing with Neltharion's final ability, Ebon Destruction. This cast will deal lethal damage to the entire raid, but if you're standing inside of a Sundered Reality patch, the damage you take will be reduced by 99%. However, standing inside of one of these patches also makes you deal 99% less damage, so you should only run into them shortly before Neltharion finishes casting Ebon Destruction. Whenever a Sundered Reality patch is used to negate Ebon Destruction, the patch will disappear. This means it'll no longer summon endless waves of Twisted Aberrations, so ideally you should stand in as many puddles as possible during each Ebon Destruction to make sure they get closed. As the phase progresses, you'll eventually run out of Sundered Reality patches, making it impossible to avoid the damage from Ebon Destruction. This serves as the hardened rage of the fight, as Neltharion will instantly kill your raid if you haven't defeated him by that point. The final boss in Aberrus the Shadowed Crucible is Scale Commander Sarkareth. Sarkareth is a 3-phase fight, and it's surprisingly short for an end boss, with most kills lasting around 6 to 7 minutes on Heroic. On pull, you should hold off on using Bloodlust, as you'll want to save it for the final phase of the fight. The main focus of Sarkareth's first phase is managing the various debuffs that he'll apply to the raid. Shortly after the fight begins, Sarkareth will cast Glittering Surge, which, on its own, is just a heavy pulse of damage to the entire raid. However, Glittering Surge has an additional interaction with Sarkareth's next ability, Oppressing Howl. He'll cast this the moment Glittering Surge's channel finishes, and it causes everyone in the raid to be knocked back and receive a debuff. Because of the knockback, it's important that nobody is standing close to the edge of the platform, as Oppressing Howl can easily knock you off and kill you. The debuff from Oppressing Howl is really important, as you'll need to clear it off every single player in the raid before the end of Phase 1. Right before he transitions into his second phase, Sarkareth will cast a second Glittering Surge, and if anyone still has the Oppressing Howl debuff on them at that point, they'll be stunned and take lethal damage. In order to remove this debuff, you'll need to intentionally stand inside of one of Sarkareth's next 2 abilities, Searing Breath or Mass Disintegrate. Searing Breath is an AoE cone aimed in the direction of a random player, and if anyone gets hit, they'll take moderate fire damage and receive a light dot. As previously mentioned, standing inside of a Searing Breath will also remove the Oppressing Howl debuff, so you should have your entire raid do this over the course of Phase 1. However, it's important to note that removing a stack of Oppressing Howl will cause the entire raid to take the pulse of damage, so you shouldn't have every player clear in one go. As long as your healers have cooldowns prepared, you should be safe to have one half of your raid clear their debuff from the first Searing Breath, while the other half clears on the second breath. Finally, clearing your debuff only requires you to take a single tick of Searing Breath, so you should move out the moment your debuff is gone to minimize your damage taken. As for the other ability, Mass Disintegrate, it'll target 2 randomly selected players and fire a line AoE in their direction after a few seconds. Affected players should run to the edges of the room and aim the Disintegrate away from the raid. This ability will also remove your Oppressing Howl debuff, so if you get targeted by it, you won't need to stand inside of Searing Breath. It's important to note that nobody aside from the targeted players should clear their debuffs with Mass Disintegrate, as the dot it leaves is far nastier than the one from Searing Breath. Throughout Phase 1, tanks will need to drag the boss counterclockwise around the room to make sure the raid doesn't get hit by Scorching Bomb, which is an ability that Sarkareth will periodically throw out. Ranged DPS and healers should bait this ability behind the raid, so the tanks don't need to move the boss quite as far. If you get targeted by Scorching Bomb, just run away before it explodes, and you should be fine. During this phase, the tanks will also need to handle Burning Claws, which is Sarkareth's initial tank buster. This ability deals heavy physical damage to the current tank, and leaves behind a moderate fire dot that lasts for 27 seconds. When the fire dot expires, it'll explode onto the raid for 15% of the damage that it dealt to the tank over the dot's duration. This means tanks should try to use their defensives to reduce the amount of ticking damage they take, as this will in turn reduce the damage of the raid-wide blast. Lastly, on heroic difficulty, you'll also have to avoid small AoE fire swirlies, which appear throughout the room for the entirety of Phase 1. These don't do anything special, just avoid being hit by them or you'll take a chunk of damage and be knocked away. Upon finishing his second cast of Glittering Surge, Sarkareth will leap to the far side of the room and become immune to damage. He'll then begin channeling Void Energy into every single player, and after a few seconds, you'll be banished into a separate phase called Emptiness Between Stars. While in this phase, you're completely alone and are unable to see Sarkareth or any other friendly players. Keep this in mind, as this will be important later. Shortly after entering the Emptiness Between Stars, 3 large swirly circles will appear, and upon running over all 3 circles and collecting them, you'll be returned to the normal fight. However, you should also try to run around and grab the tiny astral flares within the room, as each one you collect will give you a stacking 5% buff to your haste and movement speed up to a maximum of 10 stacks. When you return to the main phase of the fight, Sarkareth will be casting an interruptible ability called End Existence, and as the name implies, you'll want to stop this ability before it goes off. It's important that one of your tanks taunts Sarkareth before the cast is interrupted, since the boss threat is reset at the start of Phase 2. After the boss gets interrupted, all of the Scorching Bomb puddles from Phase 1 will disappear, and Sarkareth will begin casting his Phase 2 abilities. Sarkareth's first new ability is Abyssal Breath, which will cast immediately after being interrupted. Following a short wind-up, he'll breathe in a random direction, dealing heavy damage to anyone hit, and leaving behind a nasty shadow patch on the ground. He'll also spawn multiple Null Glimmer adds from the location where he took off, and these need to be rounded up by one of the tanks. These adds don't do anything outside of attempting to repeatedly cast Blasting Scream, which needs to be stunned or interrupted every time before it goes off. Every single DPS in your raid should hard swap to the Null Glimmers and kill them off as quickly as possible. On Heroic, these Glimmers have a buff called Rescind, which causes them to heal for 4% of their maximum health every second. To negate this, you'll need to use a buff from Sarkareth's next ability, Desolate Blossom. This is a large AoE circle that'll appear shortly after Sarkareth finishes casting Abyssal Breath, and it also applies a healing absorb effect to any player standing inside of it. Thankfully, these circles will also negate the effects of Rescind on the Null Glimmer adds, so tanks should ensure the adds are always standing inside one of these puddles. If you have a monk, Ring of Peace is an amazing way to keep these mobs locked inside of the puddles, but any other traditional knockback should also do the trick. As the fight goes on, Sarkareth will also apply stacks of Ebb and Might to nearby adds, and upon reaching 5 stacks, they'll become immune to all forms of crowd control, including interrupts. If the adds aren't dead by this point, it'll be impossible to stop their blasting screams, and the raid will instantly wipe. Throughout the second phase of the fight, you'll have to deal with 2 additional mechanics. Every so often, Void Bombs will appear close to the raid, and they need to be picked up by a player, preferably a ranged DPS, as it's easier for them to handle the mechanic. This bomb will deal pulsing damage to nearby players, and after 20 seconds, it'll explode and wipe the raid. In order to prevent this from happening, a ranged DPS will need to run over the bomb to pick it up, and then drop it off in the Emptiness Between Stars phase that we discussed earlier. In order to re-enter this phase, you'll need to reach 10 stacks of Oblivion, which is a debuff that occurs whenever you receive damage from one of Sarkareth's abilities. The fastest way to reach 10 stacks is to sit inside one of the puddles from either Abyssal Breath or Desolate Blossom. Once you enter the Emptiness Between Stars, you can safely detonate your Void Bomb without hitting anyone in the raid. While you're down here, you can also scoop up another 10 Astral Flares to get a nice haste buff before you return to the fight. During this phase, tanks will also have a new tank buster to deal with called Void Claws. This is similar to the tank buster in Phase 1, as it leaves behind a debuff which explodes upon expiration, dealing damage equal to 40% of what the tank received from the dot. However, this debuff doesn't hit the raid and instead deals damage to anyone standing within 20 yards, so the tank should just run away when it's about to expire. If you really want to, you could also enter the Emptiness Between Stars and drop off the explosion to regain your haste buff, but this is totally optional. Finally, on the heroic version of the fight, you'll have an additional mechanic to deal with called Infinite Duress. This is a dot applied to a random player, which explodes after 30 seconds and knocks the entire raid away. Unlike the other bomb effects in this fight, Infinite Duress cannot be negated by entering the Emptiness Between Stars, so you'll need to deal with it the old-fashioned way. Just make sure everyone in the raid is standing towards the center of the room, while the player with Infinite Duress runs to the edge. At that point, one of your healers can dispel the affected player to trigger the knockback, and everyone should regroup under the boss. Upon reaching 40% health, Sarkareth will leap to the far end of the room and transition into the final phase of the fight. He'll once again be immune to damage during a short bit of RP, and as the final phase begins, the raid will be pushed around the room by heavy winds. You'll need to run against this and avoid standing near a ledge so you don't accidentally get pushed to your death. The moment Sarkareth becomes active, one of your tanks will need to taunt him and drag him towards the dead center of the platform. You'll need to be fast as Sarkareth will cast his first ability, Cosmic Ascension, shortly after the phase begins. This causes the boss to leap into the air and create a massive AoE circle at his location, which the raid should move out of. Everyone should run as a group and stack up towards the far end of the room where you began the fight, as you'll immediately be targeted with a follow-up ability called Astral Formation. This causes large AoE swirlies to crash down at the location of randomly selected players, and if your raid is stacked in the right spot, they should all be centered around Sarkareth's spawn location. Not only will this make it easier to avoid the initial swirlies, but it causes large asteroids to crash down at that location, and this will be important later. Additionally, whenever Sarkareth casts Cosmic Ascension, he'll summon 3 Null Glimmerads which must be rounded up beneath the boss. In this phase, there aren't Desolate Blooms to negate the healing effect on the Null Glimmers, so it's critical that DPS players swap to the ads and kill them as quickly as possible. This is also where you should be using your Bloodlust. During this phase, Sarkareth will be held in the center of the room at all times, and your raid should stand between the boss and the large clump of asteroids at the edge of the room. Tanks should be standing closer to the entrance of the boss arena in order to face Sarkareth away from the raid. This is because the Tank Buster in Phase 3, Void Slash, will also hit any players in a frontal cone. It is absolutely critical that only the main tank gets hit by this ability, as any debuffs of Void Slash going onto a DPS player can quickly wipe the raid. Make sure you're standing on Sarkareth's butt and never walk in front of him for any reason. When a tank is hit by Void Slash, they'll receive a debuff similar to the previous ones, which explodes onto the raid when it expires. Unlike the debuff in Phase 2, this one must be taken into the Emptiness Between Stars, as otherwise the damage it deals will wipe the raid. The fastest way to reach 10 Oblivion stacks in Phase 3 is by standing inside of the AoE swirlies that appear throughout the room. Getting hit by one of these motes will give you 5 stacks of Oblivion, so tanks only need to stand in 2 of them in order to enter the Emptiness Between Stars and drop off their debuff. Throughout this phase, Sarkareth will also summon Void Bombs that must be handled the same way as in Phase 2. However, DPS players with the bombs can also use the Motes of Oblivion to quickly phase themselves into the Emptiness Between Stars and drop off the Void Bombs. You'll also still need to handle Infinite Duress during this phase, which you should just dispel whenever the raid is stacked towards the center of the room. Just make sure you don't dispel it while Sarkareth is casting another ability. There's still a few more important new mechanics in Phase 3, the first of which is Embrace of Nothingness. This is an AoE circle targeted at a random player, and your raid will need to stack inside of it to split the incoming damage. After exploding, this ability will leave behind a second AoE circle, but this one is bad and your raid should move out of it. It's important that you don't drag the split damage soak near one of the asteroids, as this would cause the asteroids to be consumed, and you'll still need to use them for Sarkareth's next ability, Scouring Eternity. This spell will cause the entire raid to take lethal damage unless they hide behind the line of sight of one of the fallen asteroids. You'll be able to see a faint whitish blue line extending from the back of the asteroids, and you'll be safe if you stand inside of it. These asteroids will also pulse damage and knock back any players standing directly on top of them, so you'll need to make sure your line of sighting Scouring Eternity a good distance away from the asteroid itself. This mechanic is the reason why it's important for your raid to bait towards the far edge of the room when dropping these asteroids. If done properly, it should create a large safe zone that covers the entire center of the room, and this makes it really easy to avoid Scouring Eternity while maintaining full uptime on the boss. Finally, Sarkareth has a mechanic called Hurtling Barrage, which causes portals to open on the edges of the room and target a random player in your raid. This functions similar to the Mass Disintegrate ability from Phase 1, but it can be a bit hard to notice since the portals are far away. Just like before, if you get targeted, you should run out of the raid so nobody else gets hit. Well, that covers all of the mechanics. As a final note, the end of the fight will likely be pretty hectic, and your raid will be taking damage from a ton of different sources. When Sarkareth is very close to death, you should ignore any active Null Glimmer ads and focus on the boss. Provided you're still interrupting every cast of Blasting Scream, you should be able to finish off Sarkareth before the ads become immune to crowd control effects. Additionally, I'd recommend immuning or sacrificing late casts of Embrace of Nothingness instead of trying to help split the damage, as this will make the fight much easier for your healers and give the raid a bit more wiggle room. As long as you handle every Void Bomb and Tank Buster correctly, and your raid doesn't lose people to Scouring Eternity, Sarkareth should go down easily. The last raid in the Awakened rotation is Mirdrassil the Dream's Hope, which will be active during weeks 3 and 6. As usual, I'll kick things off by discussing the first boss of the raid, Gnarlroot. During Phase 1, your primary goal is to manage the Lasher ads spawned by the boss. These Lashers will appear after the cast of Flaming Pestilence, which also creates AoE swirlies in a cross formation. On normal, these ads will activate automatically, but on heroic, they'll spawn in a dormant state and your raid will need to wake them up. You'll do this with another mechanic called Controlled Burn. This targets 4 players of the circle, which explodes after 6 seconds, dealing damage to anyone nearby and leaving behind a fire puddle on the ground. If this fire puddle touches any of the Lashers, they'll activate and deal a light pulse of damage to the raid. Players targeted by these circles should spread out around the room and attempt to awaken as many Lashers as possible. Any Lashers you don't activate now will automatically awaken during the second phase, so there's no benefit to delaying this. Tanks will then need to round up the Lashers underneath the boss, and all DPS should hard swap to ads and finish them off as quickly as possible. These Lashers apply a nasty stacking bleed to the tank, so don't be afraid to use defensives or call for externals if the ads take too long to die. If too many Lashers are active at once, they'll begin dealing massively increased damage and will become immune to crowd control effects, so it's important to get rid of all of them ASAP. In addition to these mechanics, tanks will need to taunt for every cast of Dreadfire Barrage. This ability fires 5 shots at the current tank, each of which deals moderate damage and applies a stacking debuff, causing them to take increased damage from future hits. It's important to note that tanks should only taunt after the entire cast is finished, as otherwise they'll be hit with the final missile and their stacks will refresh. During Phase 1, the boss will also cast Tortured Scream, a burst of raid-wide damage that healers should be mindful of, and Shadow Flame Cleave, a large avoidable cone attack aimed at a random player. After 3 sets of Lasher ads have spawned, Gnarlroot will transition into Phase 2. At the start of this phase, the boss will take 99% reduced damage, run to the center of the room, and cast Doom Cultivation, which has a few different effects. First, as previously mentioned, all remaining dormant Lashers will activate, and killing them off should be your top priority. The boss also sprouts Doom Roots, which initially appear as brown AoE swirlies that deal damage and knock back anyone hit. Once they explode, they'll create a physical root within the arena, and all of these must be destroyed in order to return to Phase 1. You'll accomplish this with Gnarlroot's next mechanic, Splintering Charcoal. This causes multiple soak circles to appear throughout the room, and at least one player must stand in each circle. This will prevent the raid from taking a burst of damage, but it will also apply a debuff to the soaker called Ember Chard. On normal, there are no soak circles, and this debuff will instead be automatically applied to multiple players in the raid. Once you have it, you'll begin taking heavy fire damage until you clear your stacks by running face first into one of the roots around the room. Each time you come into contact with a root, you'll lose 1 stack of your debuff and set the root on fire, which permanently destroys it. In order to efficiently handle this mechanic, I would recommend splitting your raid into 2 smaller groups, with one going onto each side of the boss arena. Since the roots effectively divide the room in half, and walking beneath Gnarlroot during this phase causes you to take lethal damage, you'll need to ensure that you have enough people spread around the arena to handle all of the soaks and destroy all of the roots as quickly as possible. Once all roots have been destroyed, the boss will be stunned for 20 seconds, causing him to pulse moderate damage onto the raid and take 100% increased damage from all sources. As you might imagine, this is the perfect place to use your Bloodlust, and you should ideally try to save any major cooldowns for this point. After the 20 seconds is up, the boss will return to Phase 1 and the fight will repeat. During early weeks of the raid, you'll likely kill Gnarlroot after completing this cycle 2 times, and he'll probably die during or shortly after the second burn phase. Next up is Igira the Cruel. During this fight, tanks will need to stay stacked on top of each other due to Vicious Swing, which causes all of her auto attacks to hit the next closest target. Each hit will also apply a bleed to the primary tank, which serves as the taunt swap for this fight. Personally, I feel that taunt swapping around 8 to 10 stacks felt ideal for this mechanic. The boss will also routinely cast Blistering Spears at random players. These are large AoE circles which create a patch in the ground and tethers the targeted player to a spear inside of that patch. These spears are attackable, and your DPS should kill them ASAP. To make this a bit easier, I'd recommend having the spears loosely spread around the boss's butt, and anyone who isn't targeted needs to make sure they run away. While it is possible to have multiple spears stack on top of each other, this can be a bit dangerous, and I'd only recommend it if your DPS and healers are very confident in their defensive cooldown usage. Either way, this should keep the spears relatively clumped up, making it easier for DPS to kill them while cleaving onto Igira. The boss will also sometimes cast Twisting Blade, which fires off 3 projectiles that players must dodge. The primary mechanic of this fight is Marked for Torment. Igira casts this after reaching 100 energy, and it causes her to begin forging a weapon that'll grant her an additional ability. Luckily, you get to choose the order in which Igira will learn these abilities, and you'll do this by soaking one of the 3 circles that appears throughout the room. Soaking the left circle will grant her Umbral Destruction. Soaking the middle circle grants her Smashing Viscera, and the right circle will grant Heartstopper. I'll discuss each ability in more detail shortly, but as for my recommended order, I would suggest soaking middle, then left, then right. In my opinion, this is how I would rank the abilities from easiest to hardest, so ideally you would want to try and kill Igira before she managed to gain her 3rd ability. If your group is lacking damage and you don't think you'll manage to kill her until after all 3 weapons have been soaked, I would recommend doing the reverse order, as this way you can get the hardest abilities out of the way early on. It's worth noting though that since Igira loses her previous ability every time she casts Marked for Torment, the exact order isn't really that important. Additionally, during the soaking phase on Heroic, your raid will need to be pre-divided into 3 separate groups, as soaking one of the weapons debuffs you with Flesh Mortification, which causes you to take 100% increased damage if you try to soak in the future. If tanks pop a defensive, they can probably get away with helping soak additional weapons, but this debuff will usually kill DPS or healers if they try to soak twice. Now let's discuss the 3 new abilities. Smashing Viscera comes from the middle weapon, and it causes Igira to leap towards a random player in your raid. After landing, Igira will immediately leap again onto another random player who is standing far away. On Heroic, these leaps will also shoot out lines of AoE swirlies after Igira lands. Overall, this mechanic is fairly easy to avoid as long as the targeted players move towards the sides of the room. Next up is the left weapon, which grants Umbral Destruction, a large split damage soak targeted at the primary tank. This deals heavy Shadow Flame damage to all players, but the amount is reduced if other people stand inside the circle with the tank. Doing so applies a debuff called Brutalized, which prevents you from soaking additional circles. Igira will only cast this ability twice before she creates a new weapon, so the way you handle it is really simple. During the first circle, any players in odd groups will help the tank soak, and then the other tank will taunt. When the second circle goes out, anyone in even groups will help that tank soak. Provided your raid is divided equally between odd and even groups, this should make the mechanic pretty trivial. Finally, the right weapon will grant Heartstopper, which causes multiple players to gain a large healing absorb. If the absorb isn't removed by healers, the player will explode and deal damage to the raid, but if the absorb does get cleared, the explosion will only affect people standing nearby. On Heroic, clearing this absorb will also cause the affected player to shoot out orbs from their location, which deal heavy Shadow Flame damage to the first person they come into contact with. For this reason, players with the absorb should run towards the edges of the room, and healers shouldn't remove the absorb until those players are safely outside of the raid. If you don't manage to kill Igira before she casts Marked for Torment a 4th time, there will be no weapons left to soak, causing the raid to wipe to ruinous end. Thankfully, the boss should usually be dead long before this ever happens. After killing Igira, 2 different hallways will open up, and you can choose which boss you'll fight next. The easier of the 2 is Volcoross, so I'll be discussing him. This boss is a giant serpent who sits stationary in the center of a donut-shaped platform. Before the fight begins, you'll need to divide your raid into 2 evenly sized groups, as you'll spend much of the fight on opposite sides of the room. I want to first touch upon the tank mechanics, which involve 2 interacting abilities. Molten Venom is a stacking debuff applied to the tank whenever they're hit with an auto attack. In addition to dealing ticking fire damage, this debuff increases the damage taken by the boss's next ability, Cataclysm Jaws, a massive physical damage hit. One tank should hold the boss to gain stacks of Molten Venom, and then the other tank should taunt whenever Cataclysm Jaws goes out. This process will repeat throughout the entire fight. The main ability that DPS and healers need to be mindful of is Serpent's Fury. This deals fire damage to the entire raid over 5 seconds, and it applies a debuff called Coiling Flames to a few random players. This debuff will create a circle around the affected player, causing them to deal ramping pulsing damage to anyone standing nearby, so they should move away from the raid to ensure that nobody gets hit. After 10 seconds, the debuff will expire and jump onto the closest player. After expiring a second time, the debuff will disappear entirely. Throughout the fight, Volcoross will fire AoE swirlies at random players, leaving behind small fire patches on the ground. These patches will eventually despawn, so as long as you avoid the swirlies, your exact positioning isn't super important. One of the boss's deadliest abilities is Scorchtail Crash. This causes a large shadow to appear on the floor, and shortly afterwards, Volcoross will smash down his tail, dealing lethal damage to anyone hit. On Heroic, the tail also shoots out lava waves once it hits the ground. You should make sure to run a bit further away from the shadow, just to make sure you have room to dodge these waves. The final mechanic is Flood of the Firelands. This causes 2 large soak circles to appear within the room, and half of your raid will need to soak each one. When the circle explodes, all players will take damage and be knocked away from the soak, so it's important that you stand off to one side to avoid being knocked into the lava. After these circles explode, they'll also leave behind a permanent patch of fire on the ground, and this will force each half of your raid to move in a different direction. Your raid will then remain split for a large majority of the fight, until the fire ends up consuming most of the platform and you eventually reunite on the opposite end of the donut. If you don't manage to kill the boss before the final Flood of the Firelands, the room will be consumed in fire, and he'll begin to channel Serpent's Wrath, quickly killing off the entire raid. It takes roughly 5 minutes for this to happen, but you'll rarely encounter it, as the boss will usually already be dead or your raid will have wiped earlier to a different mechanic. The next boss I'd recommend attempting is Council of Dreams. As the name implies, the fight is against a council of 3 different enemies. All 3 bosses will be active throughout the entire fight, and while they don't share a health bar, they do need to be killed at an even speed, since the bosses will heal if they reach 1 HP before the others. Urktos, the bear, should be picked up by one of your tanks at the start of the fight. The other 2 bosses can't be tanked, so tanks should drag Urktos around the room and position him close to the Dryad or the Fairy Dragon. The tank buster in this fight is Agonizing Claws, a frontal cone that deals massive physical damage. Each time Urktos casts this, he'll use it twice in quick succession, and the first hit will increase the damage you take from the second hit by 100%. I believe the intent here is for tanks to taunt after each hit of Agonizing Claws, but personally I found it was easier to take both hits and simply pop a defensive for the second one. Ultimately, either strategy works perfectly fine, it just depends on if you want to play it safe or make the tank positioning a bit easier. Urktos will also use Barreling Charge on the tank, and it is critical that your raid helps soak this. When Urktos finishes his charge, he deals massive raid-wide damage which gets reduced the more people help with the soak. On Heroic, soaking the charge applies a 30-second debuff, so you'll need half the raid to help with every single charge. I'd also recommend that tanks aim the charge through the middle of the room, as this makes it easier for ranged and healers to help with the soak. Anyone with this debuff can simply step off to the side and avoid being hit. Now, Urktos has one final ultimate ability called Blind Rage, but I'm going to put a pin in that and discuss it later, as we need to look at the other boss's regular abilities before we can take a look at all 3 ultimates. Erwin the Dryad is pretty straightforward. She summons poisonous flowers around the room, which deal heavy damage to anyone standing on top of them, along with light endless ticking damage to the entire raid. These flowers will put a good amount of strain on your healers, so it's important to get rid of them with a mechanic that we'll be discussing shortly. Erwin's only other standard ability is Poisonous Javelin, a heavy dot applied to multiple random players in your raid. This debuff can be removed with Poison Dispels, so any DPS or tanks with access to one should talent into it and help out their healers. Once again, Erwin's ultimate ability is called Constricting Thicket, but we'll be discussing that later. The third and final boss is Pip the Fairy Dragon. He'll frequently teleport around the center section of the room as the fight goes on, which makes it very difficult for tanks to stack Urktos on top of him. For this reason, ranged DPS should prioritize damaging Pip, while melee cleave off of Urktos and Erwin. Pip has an ability called Emerald Winds, which deals raid-wide damage and pushes everyone back, but the real mechanic that you need to be aware of is Polymorph Bomb. This spell causes multiple players to turn into ducks for 12 seconds, and your main goal should be to eat as many poison flowers as possible. After consuming enough flowers to remove your stacks of hungry, duck players can cast Preen, removing the debuff and returning to their normal form. On Heroic, removing your duck debuff will also turn nearby players into ducks, so if you aren't standing in the right spot, this can lead to an endless chain. In most cases, clearing up poison flowers will be your only goal as a duck player. However, one of the ducks will have a special job that relates to the boss's ultimate abilities, and this seems like a good time to finally explain what those are. Throughout the fight, the bosses will gain energy, and when they reach 100%, they'll cast their associated ultimate. Each of these abilities is cast roughly 1 minute apart. The bear will go first, then the dryad, and finally the fairy dragon. This order will repeat until the fight is over. Urktos' ultimate is called Blind Rage, and it causes him to deal heavy ramping damage that will quickly wipe your raid. However, if a duck player runs on top of him and removes their debuff while Urktos is casting, he will also turn into a duck, causing his ultimate ability to end. On Heroic, the duck ability won't actually line up with Urktos' ultimate, so you'll be forced to bounce the duck bomb between multiple players. This means you'll have a duck ready to go the moment Urktos begins casting, allowing you to interrupt the ability before it has a chance to deal any damage. When Erwin casts her ultimate, Constricting Thicket, she'll leap to the opposite side of the room and begin dealing pulsing damage to the raid. This will always line up with Barreling Charge from Urktos, and the tank needs to aim this so the bear and the dryad collide, causing her ultimate to be interrupted. Keep in mind that if your group is assigned to soak this Barreling Charge, you still need to help the tank just as you would with any other charge. Finally, Pip's ultimate is Song of the Dragon, and this is the easiest one to manage. When the boss begins casting this ability, he'll apply a shield to all members in the raid, which absorbs damage taken from the poison flowers. Everyone will need to quickly run on top of a poison flower in order to clear their shield, as otherwise the boss will stun them and deal massive damage upon finishing his cast. Since the Dryad will always summon a new set of poison flowers directly before Song of the Dragon, you don't need to worry about leaving any active if you get turned into a duck. Players just need to quickly identify the spawn location for the new set of flowers and remove their absorb shields before it's too late. While Council of Dreams is fairly mechanically complex for a 4th boss, it has no hard and rage timer, so as long as your group plays it safe and does the fight correctly, you should be able to beat the encounter. The next boss we'll be discussing is Larodar, Keeper of the Flame, which is unlocked after you've defeated Volcoross. This encounter has 2 distinct phases, with the first one mostly revolving around the Seed of Life in the center of the room, which can be used to clear up fire patches around the arena. At the start of the fight, fire will close in from the sides of the arena, forcing players to stand within the central circular area. Additionally, there are a few random fire patches scattered throughout this central section, and Larodar will cause bonus patches to appear with his abilities throughout the encounter. In order to use the seed at the center, you'll first need to charge it with life energy, and this is accomplished by defeating the fiery treants that the boss will summon. When these spawn, tanks will need to pick them up and quickly gather them beneath Larodar, as they leave behind bonus fire patches if they're allowed to move around. DPS should quickly switch to these adds and kill them off, all while ensuring that their fiery flourish cast is stunned or interrupted. Killing these adds causes them to turn into charred treants, which are friendly NPCs that need to be topped up by your healers. Upon reaching full health, these renewed treants will channel their life force into the seed, allowing players to interact with it. As previously mentioned, the primary purpose of using the seed is to spray water onto the fire patches within the room, which provides your raid with more space to move around. On Heroic, multiple people will need to know how to use the seed, as it applies a debuff preventing further use for 4 minutes. When players use the seed to spray water, its life force will be drained, so you need to make the most of this resource and clear as much fire as possible. However, on Heroic, there is one other critical use for this seed, and it involves another mechanic called Scorching Roots. These roots will fixate on random players, chasing after them and dealing moderate fire damage if anyone stands in their path. On normal, these roots can be killed off ASAP, but on Heroic, they need to be doused with water before they become attackable. It is absolutely critical that your raid douses and kills these roots ASAP, since they will also turn into a friendly NPC that your healers need to top up. Fully healing these brambles causes a renewed bramble barrier to appear, and standing inside of it is required in order to survive Larodar's next ability, Raging Inferno. The boss will cast this after he reaches 100 energy, and once he's cast this ability 3 times, he will transition into Phase 2. This is the primary mechanical loop that you'll need to deal with during Phase 1, though there are 2 other smaller abilities that we need to discuss. First, the Tank Buster, which is called Furious Charge. This will cause Larodar to fixate on the current tank for a short period of time, after which he'll charge to their location. Upon hitting the tank, Larodar deals massive damage to them, decreased by distance, and they'll receive a debuff which makes them take 100% increased physical damage for 20 seconds. On Heroic, Larodar also casts Furious Outburst when he reaches the tank, dealing damage to the entire raid, which is reduced depending on how far away the tank ran. Now, unfortunately, this mechanic isn't quite as simple as just running to the opposite side of the room, as Larodar will drop fire puddles beneath his feet whenever he moves. Doing this would then cause him to leave a long streak of fire across the boss arena, and that obviously wouldn't be good. During testing, my cheeky solution to this problem was to actually run into the fire along the sides of the room, which tanks can survive fairly easily provided they have a defensive. This allowed me to get far away from Larodar without having to drop fire patches around the room. The final Phase 1 ability is Blazing Thorns, which causes AoE swirlies to appear around the boss in a flower petal-shaped pattern. On Heroic, this also causes multiple fire orbs to spawn and move towards Larodar, so players in your raid need to soak the orbs before they reach him and increase his fire damage by 20%. While this does cause you to take a small chunk of damage, it also increases your critical strike chance by 20% for 10 seconds, so hopefully this gives DPS players a bit of motivation to do the mechanics. As previously mentioned, Larodar will transition into Phase 2 after 3 casts of Raging Inferno have gone off. However, during testing, the boss would also automatically transition if he reached 35% health, though this isn't mentioned anywhere in the dungeon journal. Regardless, when this happens, the boss will cast Consuming Flame, dealing massive pulsing damage to the raid for 16 seconds, all while dragging players towards him. If you stand underneath Larodar at this point, you will take lethal damage and die, so your raid should use abilities such as Stampeding Roar to help players run away. Upon finishing this cast and entering Phase 2, Larodar gets a completely new set of mechanics, and the Seed of Life at the center of the room will no longer be interactable. The softened rage of this fight is Searing Ash, which will deal ramping raid-wide damage as the fight goes on, so you should save your Bloodlust for this point in the encounter. Healers will also need to contend with Flash Fire, a healing absorb applied to multiple players, which causes them to explode after 8 seconds. This explosion will happen regardless of whether or not the absorb gets cleared, so the affected players will always need to run out of the raid. However, clearing this absorb is still crucial as it prevents the targeted player from also being stunned for 10 seconds. Throughout this phase, Larodar will periodically summon fire tornadoes which spin around the room, and he'll cause ashen treants to spawn along the edges of the arena. These treants will fixate on random players and slowly move towards the center of the room, leaving behind fire patches in their wake. These treants are susceptible to all forms of crowd control, so any that spawn far away from your group should be CC'd with abilities such as Freezing Trap or Paralysis. Treants that spawn close to your group should be stunned right along the edge of an existing fire patch and killed off ASAP. In Phase 2, the Tank Buster also changes to an ability called Smoldering Backdraft, which deals massive fire damage in a cone aimed at the tank. After being hit, the affected tank will be immune to healing for 30 seconds, all while they receive heavy ticking damage. Thankfully, this debuff also allows you to leech health from nearby party members, so everyone should tightly stack on the boss's butt and allow the tank to steal health from them. That being said, once the tank is fully healed, they should step away from the raid to avoid draining excess health. The final mechanic in this phase is Falling Embers, which causes multiple soak circles to appear around the room. This is a fairly standard mechanic. One player will stand in each soak circle, and if it doesn't get soaked, it explodes and deals heavy damage to the raid. As a final note, your success in Phase 2 will be heavily dependent on how cleanly you manage to play in Phase 1. Since you have until the 3rd Raging Inferno to push the boss, it may be worth it to slow down or stop your damage for a bit in order to clear up as much fire as possible, which will make it much easier to move around during the 2nd phase. The next boss we'll be discussing is Nymue, Weaver of the Cycle. This boss will sit stationary along the wall on the far side of the arena, though the rest of the room will still play a big part in the encounter. You'll quickly notice that there's a large pattern of curved lines etched into the floor on the ground, some of which are glowing green and others which are empty. This is the Verdant Matrix. It's active throughout the entire boss fight, and if you cross or stand on top of one of these lines, you'll receive a really nasty stacking dot. This makes movement throughout the fight very restrictive, so before you pull, you should have your raid loosely spread out around the center of the room. Additionally, this is yet another boss that requires you to divide your raid into 2 equally sized groups, so if you're in an odd group, you should stay towards the left side of the arena, while even players will stay towards the right side. The primary reason you want to have players spread around the room is because of these surging growth flowers that will frequently spawn during the fight. When one of these flowers is active, it'll deal pulsing damage to the raid for an entire minute. If players soak these flowers, their duration will be drastically reduced, meaning the raid will be taking much less ticking damage. This fight is absolutely brutal on healers because of the flowers and Viridian Rain, which deals constant unavoidable damage to random players. Because of this, it's critical that your raid soaks as many flowers as possible, and having at least one player in each section of the Verdant Matrix will allow you to accomplish this without being forced to run over lines. It should be noted though that 1 to 2 stacks from crossing the lines won't kill you, so don't be afraid to run out and soak a flower if nobody else is there to grab it. Just make sure you let your stacks fall off before you try to cross lines a second time. Throughout the first phase, you'll also need to avoid the mechanic Impending Loom. This causes multiple orbs to appear on top of Nymue, which are connected to each other by a green laser beam. These orbs will then spread out from the boss's location towards the far end of the room, and as they get further apart, the line connecting them will continue to expand. If you get hit by this line, you'll take a heavy chunk of damage and be stunned for 3 seconds. When this mechanic goes out, ranged and healers should scoot up as close as they can to Nymue without crossing the Verdant Matrix, as this will give you more room to move around the laser beams. Unfortunately, on Heroic this is easier said than done due to the mechanic Weaver's Burden. This is the primary tank buster of the fight, and it causes them to take heavy nature damage over 12 seconds, after which they explode and hit anyone standing nearby. On Normal, that's the entire mechanic, but on Heroic, there are bonus abilities that affect both the tank and a few other randomly selected players in your raid. For starters, all affected players will be debuffed with Woven Resonance, causing them to take 100% increased nature damage for 20 seconds. This is already a bit spooky for tanks, as Nymue's spammable spell, Threaded Blast, is partially made up of nature damage. However, this also makes things really spooky for the other affected players, as most of the unavoidable damage in this fight is also nature. There isn't much you can do about this, healers will just need to babysit you a bit more, and you probably shouldn't be soaking any flowers until your debuff expires. Additionally, any affected players will drop a Barrier Blossom at their feet after a few seconds. This creates a large void zone on the ground that deals damage and knocks back anyone who touches it. This mechanic must be dropped outside of the raid. Tanks and melee DPS should drop this along the wall near Nymue, and range should be dropping it towards the entrance of the room since you will never need that space. You should also never drop these Barrier Blossoms along the left or right side of the boss arena, as that space will be needed during the intermission. Speaking of which, once Nymue has cast Weaver's Burden 3 times, she'll cast Full Bloom, which deals heavy nature damage in a nearby area and buffs affected players with Inflorescence. This buff causes the affected player to leave behind patches of grass beneath their feet, and while anyone in the raid is standing on this patch, they'll be immune to the effects of the Verdant Matrix. Immediately after the AoE goes off, 1 Psycho Warden ad will appear on each side of the room. Nymue will then begin casting Unravel, causing her to receive 99% less damage and deal ramping raid-wide damage until both treants have been defeated. In summary, both of the tanks should be hit with the large AoE around Nymue, and they'll form a safe grass path, allowing each half of the raid to move towards and kill their respective ads. As for the Psycho Wardens, they have 2 abilities and must be picked up by the tank. Radial Flourish creates AoE swirlies that need to be avoided, and Lumbering Slam is an avoidable cone aimed at a random player. On Heroic, the Slam also spawns multiple Surging Growth Flowers that need to be soaked by your raid. Finally, the tank needs to avoid dragging the treant over a Verdant Matrix line, as doing this will trigger a Verdant Rend, dealing lethal damage to the entire raid. Once both treants have been defeated, Nymue will cast Continuum, causing the Verdant Matrix to temporarily disappear and begin reforming. This makes it easy for the entire raid to run back to their positions before all of the lines are reactivated. This entire process will repeat until the fight ends, though there are subtle soft and rage mechanics that aren't listed in the journal. After every intermission, additional lines on the floor will become part of the Verdant Matrix, and the spawn rate of Surging Growths will begin to increase. If you take too long to finish off Nymue, you'll eventually find that the room has become nearly impossible to navigate, and soak flowers will be spawning faster than you can get rid of them. Once Nymue and Larodar have been defeated, your raid can challenge Smolderon. At the start of the fight, your tank should drag Smolderon towards the edge of the room, and as the fight progresses, you'll be moving clockwise around the arena. Phase 1 of this fight primarily revolves around 2 different abilities. First is the Tank Buster, Brand of Decimation. This is a large physical hit on the current tank, along with a soak that deals massive fire damage split amongst all players inside of the circle. You should know the drill by now. Half of the raid will help the tank with every soak, and any players who stand in the soak will receive 2 debuffs. Ember Scar's Mark prevents you from soaking a second time, but it also has a bonus interaction with a Phase 2 mechanic that we'll discuss later. Cauterizing Wound is a large healing absorb, and when it gets removed, the player will drop an explosive puddle at their feet. Because of this, anyone who helps soak the tank circle should spread out and drop their puddles away from the raid. Finally, on Heroic, the affected tank will receive a 3rd debuff called Searing Aftermath, which causes them to explode for raid-wide damage after 6 seconds. This damage is reduced based on the distance between the tank and the rest of the raid. The first time this goes out, the tank should run further clockwise along the edge of the room, and after the debuff explodes, they'll need to make it back to the raid as quickly as possible. It may help to drop a Warlock Gateway for the tank, especially if they're a slower class like a Death Knight or a Paladin. The main reason the tank needs to get back quickly is because of another mechanic called Lava Geysers. This targets random players with AoE swirlies that leave behind permanent patches on the ground, and you'll want to have your entire raid stacked up on Smolderon's butt in order to bait these swirlies. If your tank is still far away from the raid when this goes off, it's possible for them to drop a swirly in front of the group, which makes movement really difficult and causes you to lose available space within the room. Thankfully, this is only an issue for the very first time you receive Searing Aftermath. For all future applications, the tank should actually run counterclockwise along the small ledge just next to the lava surrounding Smolderon's room. This will allow the tank to safely get far away from the raid, and if they get targeted by a lava geyser, it'll be baited on top of the older ones, so you won't lose any space within the room. The final mechanic during Phase 1 is Overheated, and this will go out at the exact same time as the Tank Buster. This debuff will be applied to half of the players in the raid, including one of the tanks. Affected players will receive ticking fire damage for 10 seconds, after which they'll explode and deal additional damage to anyone within 5 yards. On Heroic, these players will also shoot out 3 flame waves in different directions, and anyone hit by these waves will take massive damage. Since these waves are the deadliest mechanic in the fight by far, it's critical that any players with Overheated keep a loose spread behind the boss and face their characters away from other people. This increases the chances of the waves shooting off into the distance where nobody else is standing. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to guarantee that all 3 waves will shoot away from the group, so players will need to be ready to dodge any that are heading in their direction. Lastly, unlike many previous fights where a specific group of players was assigned to help soak with the tanks, on Smolderon you will need to adapt on the fly depending on which half of your raid gets the Overheated debuff. When the debuffs go out, anyone affected should quickly run away from the raid, but anyone not affected should immediately run over to the tank and help them soak. The boss will repeat each of these mechanics twice before he transitions into Phase 2. If you did not receive Overheated the first time, you are guaranteed to receive it the second time. This also means anyone who received Overheated first already knows that they'll be helping with the second tank soak, so you can begin positioning yourself accordingly. When the boss finishes this second set of mechanics, he'll run to the center of the room and begin Phase 2. Shortly after the phase begins, he will cast Devour Essence, which knocks all players back and removes the debuff you received from soaking the Tank Buster. This causes 5 Flame Orbs to spawn from your character and begin moving towards Smolderon. Soaking these Flame Orbs gives you a 20% damage and 10% healing buff, stacking up to a maximum of 5 times. If any of these orbs reach Smolderon, he'll consume it instead and get a 3% increase to his total damage dealt. Well, I don't think I need to tell you that soaking the orbs for a 100% damage buff is a good idea. It is important to note that you should not be standing directly on top of Smolderon before this cast goes off. This will cause your orbs to spawn very close to the boss, meaning he may end up eating a few before you have a chance to soak them. The safest bet is to have the raid group stack up roughly at the midpoint between Smolderon and the edge of the room. After the knockback, every raider should scoop up their orbs and then stack in melee range of Smolderon to begin dealing damage. Obviously, you'll also want to use Bloodlust after your raid gets the 100% damage buff, though the exact time you'll use it will vary depending on when your DPS players have their cooldowns. In total, you'll see this phase 4 times before hitting the Hardened Rage, so all that matters is you use your Bloodlust during one of these 4 phases. This part of the fight is mostly a glorified damage and healing check, with DPS players getting to pump their hearts out and healers being forced to contend with the massive pulsing damage dealt by Smolderon. However, he does cast one additional mechanic called World in Flames. This causes large sections of the room to glow before exploding with fire, dealing heavy damage to anyone hit and leaving behind a nasty dot. The active sections will frequently alternate throughout Phase 2, so you'll need to be on your toes and ensure that you're always standing in a safe part of the room. After 30 seconds, the second phase will end, and Smolderon will return to Phase 1. Just like on the pole, the tank will drag Smolderon to the edge of the room close to the most recent fire patches. This process will repeat 4 times, and during each iteration of Phase 1, roughly an entire quarter of the room will be covered in lava. By the end of the fight, the only available space should be towards the center of the room, and you'll need to defeat Smolderon before he kills your group with an endless spam of World in Flames. The penultimate boss of the raid is Tindral Sageswift, and this is the infamous dragon riding encounter that many players have heard about. However, Phase 1 of the fight starts on foot like any normal raid boss. For tanks, you'll need to manage Searing Wrath, which is a stacking debuff applied by Tindral's auto attacks. You'll usually want to taunt the boss for this at around 8 to 10 stacks. Additionally, tanks will need to manage an ability called Blazing Mushroom. This causes a ring of 3 explosive mushrooms to gradually spawn around Tindral, and soaking one will deal heavy physical damage and light magical damage. As you might imagine, failing to soak a mushroom will cause the raid to take a massive hit, and if you soak one, you'll receive a debuff that increases your mushroom damage taken by 500% for 3 seconds. The way you handle this mechanic is fairly simple. One tank will soak the first and third mushrooms, and the other will soak the second mushroom. While you could alternate who is taking 2 mushrooms and who is taking 1, it ultimately doesn't matter. The rest of the phase involves an interaction between 3 different abilities. First, and most importantly, is Mass Entanglement. This causes all players to explode for moderate damage to anyone standing within 3 yards, and it roots them in place. This root effect will persist until you've killed the attackable vines beneath your feet, and until they're broken, every player will take heavy ticking damage. Your raid should stack up as tightly as possible without overlapping your circles, and then the moment the roots appear, everyone should deal as much AoE damage as they can. It's worth noting that abilities such as Tiger's Lust, Blessing of Freedom, Master's Call, and others can instantly clear these roots without the need to kill off the vine. Now, in a perfect world, your raid should have enough damage to quickly blast all of these roots in mere seconds before any other abilities go off. Realistically though, your damage probably isn't that amazing, or you may have a few players stranded in the middle of nowhere who weren't able to stack up in time. This can be a bit problematic due to Tindral's next 2 abilities. First, Falling Star will deal unavoidable damage to the entire raid, but it also causes many smaller avoidable swirlies to appear throughout the platform. It's entirely possible for these swirlies to land on top of you before your roots have been broken, and while this isn't necessarily going to kill you, it'll still hurt pretty bad. On the other hand, Tindral's next ability, Fiery Growth, will potentially cause a wipe if you don't handle it properly. This causes multiple players to receive a fire dot which explodes after 20 seconds, and it can be dispelled earlier if you choose to do so. However, when this dot gets dispelled, the player leaves behind a giant patch of fire beneath their feet, so it's crucial they run away from the raid before their debuff gets removed. If this expires or gets dispelled on top of the raid, it is almost guaranteed to cause a wipe. Since you have no control over who gets picked for this debuff, you'll want to ensure that their roots get cleared as quickly as possible so they can begin running out of the raid. The most reliable way to accomplish this is by using the aforementioned utility spells that remove movement and pairing effects. Any classes in your raid with these abilities should be assigned to immediately use them on any players affected by Fiery Growth who are still stuck inside of an entangling root. If for whatever reason you don't have access to these spells, you'll just need to hard swap to the affected player's roots and kill them off ASAP. The final Phase 1 mechanic is Fire Beam, which causes 2 large AoE circles to appear close to the raid. These circles will explode, dealing massive damage to anyone stuck inside of them, and it'll fire off a smaller series of laser beams that move throughout the room. These smaller beams deal near lethal damage to anyone hit, so it's critical that the raid runs far away from these fire beams to make them easier to avoid. This series of mechanics will repeat twice throughout Phase 1, and immediately after the second set of fire beams explode, Tindral will shift into his owl form and begin the first intermission. The boss will shoot out empowered feathers across the platform, and interacting with one allows you to hop onto your dragon riding mount and chase after him. This section of the fight is a fairly straightforward dragon riding obstacle course. There are multiple green orbs floating in the sky called Dream Essence, and passing through one will give your raid a stacking temporary 5% damage buff. In total, it's possible to collect 10 of these essences on the way to the next platform. Upon collecting an essence, it'll also turn into an Emerald Gale, which functions exactly like the wind speed boosts that you'll encounter during dragon riding races in the open world. This one is a bit special though, as passing through it will also restore 3 vigor. This means you'll have a near infinite amount of vigor during the dragon riding phase, so you can go all out using your vigor abilities in an attempt to reach the next platform as quickly as possible. Along the way, you'll also need to avoid various obstacles which slow you and drain your vigor if you collide with them. While there are obviously ways to optimize your dragon riding, I don't really want to get into the weeds about that during this video. All you really need to know for this phase is that collecting all of the Dream Essence is really important, and you should assign the best dragon riders in your raid to accomplish this. Everyone else in your raid should simply focus on making it to the next platform as quickly as possible, since Tindral will begin casting an ability called Supernova the moment he lands. This causes him to gain a large absorb shield, and if the shield isn't broken before his cast finishes, the entire raid will wipe. Once you've interrupted Tindral's Supernova, Phase 2 will begin. For the most part, this is identical to Phase 1, with a single exception. Instead of turning into a Boomkin and casting Fire Beam, Tindral will shift into his Treant form and cast Flaming Germination. This causes multiple seeds to appear across the platform, and players will have 10 seconds to stomp all of them out. Every time you stomp on a seed, you take a chunk of fire damage and receive a stacking debuff that increases your damage taken from stomping seeds by 50%. Thankfully, this debuff can be completely negated by immunities or a rogue's Cloak of Shadows, so a single immune player with a speed boost should be able to clear out most of the seeds. That being said, everyone in your raid should at least chip in and stomp 1 to 3 seeds, as there are quite a lot spawned during every cast, and even having a single one go off will likely lead to a wipe. Just as before, Tindral will shift into his Owl form after he's cast all of his abilities 2 times, and another Dragon Riding intermission will begin. Functionally, the second intermission is exactly the same as the first one. A few players in your raid should pick up the Dream Essence, and you'll want to reach the final platform ASAP to stop Tindral's cast of Supernova. The only difference this time is that a few Dream Essences are located behind the final platform, so at least one player will need to do a bit of extra Dragon Riding before they land and begin attacking the shield. The final phase of this fight is almost identical to phases 1 and 2, with Tindral alternating between casts of Fire Beam and Flaming Germination. All of the other mechanics are exactly the same. However, instead of the phase ending after each ability is cast twice, it'll actually continue for quite a while. During testing, we found that the Hardened Rage is triggered at 8 minutes and 50 seconds, which causes Tindral to begin casting an unstoppable supernova that will eventually one-shot the raid. Now that Tindral is dead, you're able to face off against Fyrakk, the final boss within Amirdrassil and the Dragonflight expansion. Fyrakk's encounter has 3 distinct phases, and during the first one, your primary goal is to stop him from lighting Amirdrassil's roots on fire. The phase will end when Fyrakk reaches 70% health, but if Amirdrassil's roots catch on fire before that point, it'll trigger Amirdrassil Burns, which instantly wipes your entire raid. The fire creeping towards the roots will spawn as a result of 2 different abilities. Shortly after the phase begins, Fyrakk will cast Wildfire, causing the far edge of the room to be blanketed in fire puddles. He'll cast this ability periodically throughout phase 1, causing the wall of fire to slowly expand in the direction of the roots. Fire puddles will also be created by Fyrakk's next ability, Firestorm, which targets multiple players in the raid with AoE circles. Upon expiration, a meteor will crash down at the location of the players, dealing heavy damage to anyone standing nearby and leaving behind a new fire puddle on the ground. It is absolutely critical that anyone targeted by these meteors drops them along the existing fire, as otherwise Fyrakk will expand the flames much faster upon his next cast of Wildfire. In addition to these meteors, Firestorm will also create a bunch of smaller AoE swirlies that the raid will need to avoid. As long as you don't mess up the positioning of these meteors, you should have more than enough time to push Fyrakk before the flames reach Amirdrassil's roots. While that's the most important part of Phase 1, Fyrakk still has multiple additional mechanics that you need to be aware of. The main tank buster in this phase is Firalat's Bite, a rectangular AoE aimed at the current tank which deals heavy physical damage and moderate Shadow Flame damage. While the initial hit will only deal damage to the current tank, the line AoE is a separate effect called Firalat's Flame, and it deals bonus Shadow Flame damage to anyone it passes through. Tanks should obviously aim Fyrakk towards the fire, as that means nobody else will need to worry about dodging the projectile. In addition to this, the ability will leave behind a debuff on the active tank, which causes them to take bonus Shadow Flame damage whenever Fyrakk lands an auto attack. This effect does technically stack, but it's honestly not that scary, and many tank classes could reasonably solo the entirety of Phase 1. That being said, it's usually safer to just taunt at 2 stacks, as that means your healers won't need to work as hard to keep you alive. Speaking of healers, throughout Phase 1 they'll need to manage a magic debuff called a Flame, which Fyrakk will apply to random players. This debuff deals ramping damage over time, and if it doesn't get quickly dispelled, it can dish out a lot of damage to the raid. If you have priests in your group, they should save their mass dispels to quickly remove multiple of flame debuffs at the same time, and it can also be cleansed by the Dwarf or Dark Iron Dwarf racials. The other primary source of raid damage comes in the form of Blaze, which causes line AoEs to appear on randomly selected players. If you're targeted by the Blaze, it's generally accepted that you should stop moving, and anyone without the debuff can sidestep your line to avoid the damage. If you start running with the line, you may accidentally hit multiple players in your raid, which just makes things far more difficult for your healers to manage. If you find yourself standing in multiple overlapping Blaze lines, it's usually still better to remain stationary, though you should try to press the defensive if you feel you're at risk of dying. Every now and then, Fyrakk will also cast Dream Rend, causing a gigantic rift to appear on top of the current tank. After a few seconds, the rift will activate and pull players towards it, and if you get sucked in, you'll take lethal damage. Thankfully, the pull effect on this is really weak, and you have plenty of time to react before the rift opens, so as long as you run away from it, you should be fine. The final mechanic in Phase 1 is called Predator, and it's fairly minor. If the active tank happens to run too far away from Fyrakk, he'll cast this and immediately leap towards them, dealing bonus damage when he lands. In practice, this just serves as an easy way to reposition Fyrakk after a big move, usually due to Wildfire or Dreamrend. That being said, you also need to be mindful of this at the very start of the fight, as Fyrakk will almost always use Predator on the person who pulls him. If a DPS pulls too early, this could result in Fyrakk instantly one-shotting them, which isn't the best way to start a pull. As previously mentioned, Fyrakk will end the first phase upon reaching 70% health. At this point, he'll cast Incarnate, causing him to leap into the sky and crash back down, which bounces the entire raid into the air and deals moderate damage to all players. If you activate a Warlock Gateway immediately before Fyrakk lands, you can counteract this bounce effect, which makes it easier for the raid to reposition for the upcoming intermission. Shortly after landing, Fyrakk will cast Corrupt and channel a Fire Breath into a Mirdrasil. You'll need to be careful during this cast, as standing in front of Fyrakk or directly beneath them will cause you to take lethal damage. Once Fyrakk begins his channel, he'll gain a large Absorb Shield that your raid will need to break before Corrupt's cast finishes. If the cast finishes and the shield is not broken, your raid will instantly wipe. If the shield is broken before the cast finishes, you'll transition into Phase 2. Things aren't quite that simple, however, as during the channel, Fyrakk will also cause the nearby fire puddles to coalesce into orbs that slowly drift towards him. Each one of these orbs needs to be soaked by a player in your raid, as they explode for lethal damage if they manage to reach Fyrakk. As long as all players in your group evenly spread out around the boss, you should be able to catch all of the orbs before they reach him. After Fyrakk's shield is broken, he'll fly into the air once again and push everyone back with strong winds that you'll need to run against. He'll then crash down on the far end of the platform, dealing fall-off damage to the entire raid. Upon landing, Fyrakk will cast Predator on the active tank and leap towards them, which marks the start of Phase 2. This phase carries over multiple different abilities from Phase 1. Primarily Blaze, a Flame debuffs, and the Fyrak's Bite tank busters. However, you won't spend much time actually fighting Fyrakk, as he'll leap back into the air after his second cast of Fyrak's Bite. Before this happens, tanks should drag Fyrakk towards the edge of the platform opposite a Mirdrasil, as this is the safest spot in the room for reasons we'll discuss shortly. Right before leaping away, Fyrakk will cast Greater Firestorm, which is a bit different from the version in Phase 1. It still summons many AoE swirlies, but this time there are only 2 meteors and one will be targeted on each of the tanks. Upon exploding, these meteors won't leave behind a fire puddle, but will instead summon an ad called Burning Colossus. Tanks will need to quickly establish threat on these mobs, as they'll one-shot a DPS player if given the chance. Everyone in your raid should hard swap to these colossi and burn them as quickly as possible, since they'll explode if they aren't killed fast enough. While all of this is going on, Fyrakk will cast a Deep Breath through the middle section of the arena, and as with many abilities in this fight, it deals lethal damage to anyone hit. This is one of the reasons why you should be standing on the far side of the room, as your raid will have a much easier time dodging the breath. Once the cast finishes, a line of smaller ads called Screaming Souls will appear, and they must be stunned or interrupted as your DPS kill them off. Death Knights will make this encounter significantly easier, as Gorfiend's Grasp and Abomination Limb allow you to easily clump up the Screaming Souls and cleave them down at the same time. Non-DK players should still try to help out by using their knockback abilities on any isolated ads. If a soul isn't interrupted, it'll channel ramping raid-wide damage, which puts a lot of strain on your healers. In case it isn't obvious, tanks should be dragging the Colossi on top of the largest clumps of these souls, as that allows DPS to AoE them all down at once. Shortly after finishing his breath, Fyrakk will crash back down and re-engage the tank. This entire process will repeat one more time until the fight transitions into Phase 3. However, I've held off on discussing the most important mechanic of this phase, which involves the Heart of a Mirdrasil. You'll be able to see the tree's health bar at the top of your screen, and it'll constantly tick down as the phase progresses. If the tree's health reaches 0, the raid dies and the fight ends. There's only one way to keep the tree alive, and that's by healing up the Kaldorei spirits which spawn on the opposite side of the room. These ghosts will appear in packs of 5, and they'll start with low health that continually drains as they move across the arena. Your healers are responsible for immediately switching to these ghosts and blasting them with healing until they're back to full. Once a ghost reaches full health, they'll receive an Absorb Shield that makes them immune to damage, at which point healers can safely ignore them and go back to helping the raid. If a ghost safely makes it across the room and touches a Mirdrasil, the tree will receive a bit of healing. If enough spirits are healed and reach the tree, you'll be able to counteract the constant damage and survive until Phase 3. That being said, lack of healing isn't the only thing that endangers the spirits. These friendly NPCs will also take full damage from most abilities within the fight, such as Blaze Lines, Fyrakk Tank Busters, and other Screaming Souls dealing pulsing damage. As such, it's important for all players within your raid to be mindful of the spawn locations of these spirits. If you aren't careful and too many of them die to Blaze Lines, you won't have enough spirits left to keep the tree alive, which will lead to a wipe. This is yet another reason why that spot on the far side of the room is a great place to stand, as ghost packs will always spawn on the sides of the arena and never in the middle. You'll still need to watch your Blaze Lines even if you're standing in this spot, as sometimes they appear at a weird angle and may snipe Kaldrai spirits from far away. Lastly, if you recall during Phase 1, I told you to never move around while you have a Blaze Line, as you don't want to risk hitting other players in your raid. Well, in Phase 2, things are a bit different, as avoiding the ads takes priority over potentially hitting people in your group. You should still be smart about your movement, of course, but when in doubt, run that line out. Assuming you've managed to properly deal with the hostile ads and keep Amirdrassil alive, Fyrakk will eventually transition into his final phase. Note that this transition is on a timer and doesn't automatically trigger at a certain percentage, which means you can push Fyrakk really low before entering Phase 3. In fact, it's technically possible to kill him here and skip the final phase entirely, but this requires an inhuman amount of raid damage which 99% of groups won't be able to reach. Just like in Phase 1, Fyrakk will cast Incarnate, leaping into the air and crashing down. You could use the Warlock Gate again to negate the bounce, but it's less important this time as you won't need to immediately reposition at the start of the third phase. The only familiar mechanic that carries over into Phase 3 are the Blaze Lines, and while they'll function exactly as they did before, they're a bit more problematic during this phase for reasons we'll soon discuss. The Tank Buster now has been changed to Infernal Maw, which deals massive damage and applies a permanent stackable debuff on the current tank. This debuff doesn't actually increase the amount of damage you take within the fight, it just deals heavy ticking damage every second. While high stacks of this debuff will hurt quite a bit, there is no forced taunt swap, and many groups will actually opt to have a Blood Death Knight solo tank the entirety of this phase. Other tank classes can technically fill this role as well, but nothing compares to the power of Deathstrike when you're dealing with constant magic damage. If your tanks aren't comfortable with this strategy, the next best option is to taunt after every 4 casts of Infernal Maw. Fyrakk has 2 other dangerous abilities that he'll cast periodically throughout Phase 3, the first of which is Shadow Flame Breath. This one is pretty straightforward. He'll turn towards a random player and send a conal breath in their direction. Don't stand inside of it or you'll die. Eternal Firestorm is yet another variation of the Meteor mechanic, but this time instead of creating a fire puddle or Colossus ad, it'll spawn a tornado that circles around a small area. If you're targeted by this ability, it's crucial that you run all the way out to the edges of the platform and drop your meteor away from other players. The tornado can be an absolute menace if it's accidentally dropped towards the center of the room, but if it's just rotated off to the side, it usually won't be an issue. With those mechanics out of the way, we can finally discuss the last and most important abilities in this encounter, the Seeds of Amirdrassil and Apocalypse Roar. Fyrakk will cast this roar multiple times throughout Phase 3. The first roar will occur at around 30 seconds after the phase begins, and subsequent roars will be spread apart by roughly 40 seconds. The roar will instantly deal lethal damage to the entire raid, and it also applies an extremely nasty dot just in case you somehow manage to survive the initial burst. The only way to keep your raid alive through these roars is by using the Seeds of Amirdrassil. 4 of these seeds will fall from the sky shortly after Phase 3 begins, and each one needs to be picked up by a player in your raid. Shortly before the roar goes off, one of these players can use an extra action button to place their seed on the ground and create a patch of grass. When you step inside of this patch, it'll grant you a massive absorb shield, which allows your raid to survive the roar. Apocalypse Roar will also cause any active grass patches to ignite, and after a few seconds they'll turn into fire puddles. This means that each patch will only be usable for a single roar, and you should try to place the grass close to the edges of the room so the eventual fire puddle doesn't take up too much space. As for who should pick up the seeds, mobile range DPS such as hunters or mages are generally the best candidates, but you can technically assign it to whomever you want. Either way, these players need to be really skilled at dodging mechanics, because coming into contact with a single instance of avoidable damage, such as a blaze line, breath, tornado, or AoE swirly, will cause the seed to explode. Not only does this deal a near-lethal burst of damage to your group, but it also deprives your raid of the ability to survive a single cast of Apocalypse Roar. In case it wasn't obvious, Apocalypse Roar serves as the soft enrage of the fight. Once the 5th cast goes out, you'll no longer have any seeds to mitigate the damage, so you'll need to kill Fyrakk before this point. If you waste any seed uses or one of them exploded earlier, your time frame will be even tighter. That being said, most groups tend to kill the boss after only 2 seeds have been used, so unless your damage is really bad, there is some flexibility in case you lose a seed. In fact, many groups opt to dump 2 seeds on every set and aim to kill Fyrakk before the 3rd cast of Apocalypse Roar. This can actually make the fight easier in some cases, as you're removing seeds from the fight much earlier, which reduces the risk that one of them explodes and kills the raid. Obviously, you should only consider the strat if you know your damage is good enough to make it on time. And with that, we've covered everything that you need to know in order to clear every Dragonflight raid boss on normal and heroic difficulty. If you found this video helpful, I'd highly encourage you to toss it a like, as that'll help other people find it as well.